Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're closing your eyes under dim bedroom lights, walking quietly beneath city towers, or just letting your thoughts drift in a late-night kitchen, you are welcome here. Because tonight, we're travelling into the shadow of near erasure, into the story of a volcanic firestorm that almost ended us. This is reflective science and cinematic history for minds that move slow and wonder deeply. There is a forgotten catastrophe, buried beneath lakes and glaciers, a silence left behind by fire, a supervolcano that erupted 74,000 years ago and very nearly deleted our species from the planet. But this is not a tale of fire and ash alone. It is not the story of death, but of what remained, of the few thousand who survived and the world they emerged into quiet, dark, and forever changed. Oh, and if you're the kind of strange and thoughtful human who enjoys this kind of slow-burning science-based storytelling, look just below the video. The button says subscribe. Tap or press it. You can unsubscribe anytime. There's a bell next to it too. If you tap that, it'll let you know when new stories arrive. Your support helps this channel survive. Without it, new stories like this simply can't be made. And where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. A quiet reminder that we are all here, listening together. Also, feel free to fall asleep. There are timestamps in the description if you want to find your way back. And now, we begin with a sky that turned to stone. 95% of all humans gone. Not gradually, not over the passage of empires or the shifting of centuries, but in a single shudder of the earth. The disappearance wasn't marked by war or disease, not by a predator stalking through the tall grasses of prehistory. It came instead with silence, and then with ash. A darkness that fell not from philosophy, but from the sky itself. Somewhere around 74,000 years ago, the planet convulsed in a way it rarely does, with a supervolcanic eruption so vast, so indifferent, that it nearly ended us. This is not metaphor. This is not speculation. This is genetic memory, written not in stone, but in the blood of every living human being today. For once, the story is not how we conquered. It is how we almost didn't make it. What does it mean to come that close to the edge? To teeter at the very brink of non-existence, and then somehow just barely continue? The DNA we carry, the twisted ladder of our ancestry, is missing entire rungs. Geneticists, peering back through time with the molecular tools of the modern age, have seen something strange. A pattern so narrow, so constricted, that it suggests our ancestors were once reduced to no more than a few thousand scattered individuals. A population bottleneck, as mass vanishing, a question etched in protein and probability. How did we survive this? And more haunting still, what kind of world did we awaken into when the ash began to settle? To answer that, we must first descend, not into myth, but into magma. We must return to a place that sleeps beneath the forests of modern-day Sumatra, a sleeping scar known today as Lake Toba. A caldera, the broken crown of a collapsed volcano, now filled with water, ringed by mountains that were once the outer walls of an unimaginable force. It is here that the earth tore open. It is here that one of the most violent eruptions in planetary history took place, expelling enough ash and gas to plunge the world into darkness. The eruption was not loud in the way a storm is loud. It was a silence that rewrote the sky. It injected ash into the stratosphere, blotting out the sun. Temperatures dropped. Photosynthesis faltered. Ecosystems unraveled like loose thread. But what happens, truly, when sunlight disappears? When you cannot count the days because there are no days to count? When even time seems to hesitate? The effects would not have been instant. They would have spread like ripples, invisible at first. A slow hunger. An absence of growth. Animals growing weaker. Plants refusing to fruit. Migrations that no longer made sense, and finally, people. People looking at each other across dim firelight, wondering if this was the end. But the end of what? The end of a village? A family line? Or something far greater? What does it mean to almost vanish? Not as a person, but as a species? we start with that silence. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is real. And in that silence, something unthinkable was unfolding. From the perspective of deep time, it happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, small bands of Homo sapiens were scattered across Africa and parts of Asia, curious, adaptive, already crafting tools and shaping firelight into safety. The next, their numbers were carved away, not by tooth or claw, but by atmospheric veils of ash. These people had no name for Toba, no concept of volcanism or climate collapse, but they felt its breath. The skies dimmed, the seasons warped, and the animals they followed began to vanish. Rivers shrank. The rhythm of the world, once predictable in its chaos, had turned strange. How do you track a deer that no longer walks its ancestral path? How do you plant in soil that will not answer you? These are not questions of geology. These are questions of grief. For the survivors, if they could be called that, life became an act of remembering what used to be. And yet they continued. Somehow in unknown pockets of the world, perhaps along coasts or within sheltered valleys, a few thousand held on. They didn't triumph. They endured. They didn't rebuild. They waited. And in doing so, they became the rootstock for all who would come after. The evidence of this catastrophe is written most clearly not in stone tools or skeletal remains, but in our own genomes. When scientists study mitochondrial DNA, that delicate thread passed from mother to child, they see an eerie pattern, a sudden narrowing, like a throat closing. Almost all living humans today are descended from a shockingly small number of ancestral mothers. The variability, the branching tree of human diversity suddenly pinches inward around this time. This is the fingerprint of a bottleneck. And the timing? It aligns almost too perfectly with the Toba eruption. But correlation is not causation, is it? Could something else have caused our numbers to dwindle so catastrophically? Disease? Drought? War? Perhaps. And yet, the magnitude of the genetic bottleneck, the sheer drop in diversity, suggests something truly planetary in scale. Something that touched every climate, every biome, every fragile group of people scraping meaning from the edge of survival. Only a force that rewrote the sky itself could explain what followed. Toba did not merely change the climate, it redefined what survival meant. What must it have felt like to live through that long twilight? To pass entire seasons with no green shoots, to watch the sun fail to rise in the same way day after day, dimmed and distant, its warmth stolen by ash miles above. To try to explain it, not in science, but in story. To children who had never known a normal world. Did they name the darkness? Did they fear that they had angered something? Or did they simply stop speaking of the sky at all? And if they did survive by forgetting, what do we risk by remembering? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. For in the remembering we confront the truth that humanity's future was once a coin flip, not decided by greatness or destiny, but by luck, timing, and the thin margins of geography. Some groups may have lived far enough from the ashfall to escape the worst of it. Others may have survived by sheer accident, caught in a pocket of climate stability while the rest of the world collapsed into famine and cold. It's humbling to realise that your existence, and mine, may depend on the trajectory of a single ash cloud, or the tilt of a mountain pass that diverted its flow. The Toba supereruption was not merely a loud event, it was vast beyond reckoning. By modern estimates, it expelled nearly 3,000 cubic kilometres of rock, ash and gas, enough to cover entire continents in a soft, choking shroud. The plume reached high into the stratosphere, injecting sulfur aerosols that would scatter sunlight and cool the planet. This was not a regional disaster. It was a planetary reset. A volcanic winter may have followed, lasting not weeks or months but years, an unseason anchored in the sky. What happens to a thinking species when the stars become their only reliable light? What does it do to memory, to language, to myth? The survivors of Toba would not have understood the chemistry of aerosols or the physics of light scattering, but they understood absence, they understood hunger. And in that hunger, meaning itself becomes malleable. The rhythms of life, seasonal migration, birth, harvest, would have unravelled, and so too, perhaps, did their gods. There is an idea that catastrophe resets belief, that when the world changes too fast, the mind must change with it. Could the terror of Toba have sparked new ways of thinking? Could the survivors have emerged with different notions of time, of death, of the self? If culture is a response to environment, then what kind of culture grows from silence, from scarcity, from the fading echoes of lost others? What echoes do we still carry? Even now, the story of Toba lives mostly in data and deduction. There are no oral histories that speak of the event directly, no legends that can be traced back with certainty. But perhaps there are shadows of it, faint and distorted, hidden within the archetypes that echo across cultures. Myths of the sun going dark, of fire from the heavens, of a flood not of water, but of ash. These stories, passed from generation to generation, might be the fractured reflections of a time when the sky betrayed us, and in the absence of direct memory, it is the earth that remembers. In lake beds across India, layers of glassy ash still rest undisturbed, laid down like the pages of a forgotten book. In ice cores drawn from Greenland and Antarctica, sulphuric traces whisper of a sudden, global dimming. The rocks remember even what we do not. And perhaps that is what makes the story of Toba so haunting. It is not merely a tale of destruction, but of silence, a silence so total it erased its own witnesses. Most extinction events leave bones, fossils, clear demarcations in the strata of time. But this was an almost extinction, a narrowing, not a termination. There were no cities to crumble, no books to burn, only scattered bands of human beings, each carrying a flicker of what had been, each hoping in their own unknowable way that they were not the last. Is this, then, the secret heartbeat of our species? Not triumph, but persistence. Not dominance, but fragility wrapped in astonishing resilience. That we exist at all, you and I, is because a handful of our ancestors refused to stop walking, refused to stop tending the fire, even when the world gave them no reason to believe it would ever grow warm again. In the long chain of miracles that led to us, the miracle of Toba is not that we survived the eruption, but that we survived what came after. Because in truth, the death came slowly, not in a wave, but in a fade. Crops failed before they could be planted, herds thinned and disappeared, social networks already tenuous began to unravel. In such small populations, a single failed season could be fatal. Infants born into smoke-filled air may never have taken a full breath. Elders withered not just from hunger, but from watching too many empty horizons. The death toll is not just measured in numbers, but in memory, in songs unsung, in stories left untold. And yet, in some dark crevice of the world, life stirred, adapted, waited. There is a kind of quiet intelligence in survival, a way of seeing the world not as a thing to be mastered, but as a rhythm to be endured. Maybe they found shellfish along the coasts. Maybe they followed animals that still remembered where the old water ran. Maybe they learned to rely not on abundance, but on each other. What kind of community forms in a world where the future has disappeared? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the beginning of something, a turning point. Because after Toba, something strange happened. Though our numbers were fewer, the traces we leave behind begin to change. We see the first evidence of long-distance tool transport, more complex social structures, symbolic thinking, perhaps even the roots of language as we know it. It is almost as if staring into the abyss sharpened our vision. Could it be that nearly losing everything made us more human? There is no single answer, no map drawn in the dust that leads us back to the moment we turned away from the edge. But in every genome, in every step we take, that narrow passage lives on, a tight curve in the trail of time, one we barely made it around. A sky of fire behind us, a world remade ahead, and beneath it all, the memory of ash. Even if we no longer remember the eruption consciously, something in us seems to remember the feeling. That deep unease in the presence of silence, that instinctive awe before mountains and storms. We carry perhaps a faint echo of the moment when the sky ceased to be trustworthy. Maybe that is why we stare so long into sunsets. Maybe that is why fire still mesmerizes us. somewhere in the chain of ancestral nights, our species learned that flame meant both safety and warning, that it could save and it could end. The Toba eruption was not the first disaster our planet ever birthed, nor would it be the last. But for humanity, it was an event of almost mythical proportions. It pushed us through a bottleneck that stripped away not just lives, but possibilities. Countless genetic lines vanished forever. Each one was a story that will never be told, an imagination that never found its language. Out of what might have been tens of thousands, perhaps only a few thousand souls remained. It was enough. Barely. And from that narrow remnant all modern humans descend, a lineage thinned by catastrophe, then stretched again across continents like a thread pulled taut but unbroken. What must it mean to be descended from near ghosts? To live, unknowingly, as the echo of those who nearly disappeared? This is not a melancholy thought, but a sacred one. It reframes survival not as victory, but as continuity. The fact that we can even ponder the past, that we can shape words into remembrance, means that something ancient succeeded. Those nameless survivors carried fire forward. They carried story forward, even if the words themselves were lost. They endured the world's longest night so that thought itself could see another dawn. And that dawn, when it came, would have been different. Imagine waking to a world stripped bare. The forests thinned, the air still heavy with dust, the animals fewer and wary. Yet there is light, pale and trembling but real. The sun returns, though weaker, and the survivors begin to move again, drawn by instinct, curiosity, and the slow pull of life itself. They do not know they are repopulating the planet. They do not know they are history's hinge. They only know hunger, motion, and the faint memory of warmth. In that moment, the story of humanity began again. It began smaller, quieter, humbler, but also wiser. To almost vanish is to understand in some cellular way the cost of being. Every step since Toba has been taken with that ancient gravity beneath it. Every flame we light, every shelter we build, every language we invent, all of it exists because once, long ago, the sky burned and we did not. And that is the mystery at the heart of our kind. We are the children of fire and of the silence that followed it. But before the silence, there was song. Not in the form of melody, perhaps, but in the cadence of footsteps across open grasslands, the rustle of reeds along a riverbank, the soft click of stone tools echoing from the walls of a rock shelter. Long before the sky turned dark, our ancestors moved beneath a different sun, one that still rose and fell with predictable warmth, one that lit a world in motion. Around 100,000 years ago, the earth was a vast and varied canvas, painted with life, and into that painting stepped us, Homo sapiens, not as rulers, but as wanderers. What did the world feel like to them? Not in abstraction, but in each breath and glance and hesitation. The humans of that age were anatomically modern, but cognitively nascent. Eyes just beginning to see the patterns hidden in stars, minds just beginning to remember more than they forgot. They were not yet masters of the earth, but apprentices of its rhythm. Along the river systems of eastern and southern Africa, they followed the herds. In the highlands, they learned the temper of wind. In coastal shallows, they cracked open mollusks and watched the moon pull the tides. Movement was life, motion was memory, and motion was spreading, with every generation a little farther, eastward toward the Horn of Africa, through the open savannas of what is now Sudan and Ethiopia, and beyond, past the Red Sea, into Arabia, then along the southern coastlines of the continent-spanning landmass we now call Eurasia. The journey was not linear. It was not a campaign. It was curiosity braided with necessity, the slow and uncertain migration of small groups, rarely more than a few dozen, carrying with them their fires, their memories, and their chants. How do you map a world that does not yet have names? We know of their paths not because they wrote them down, but because their bones linger in caves, because their tools remain buried beneath ancient sand, because their genetic traces can still be seen in ours. In Israel, in southern India, in parts of Southeast Asia, fragments of early Homo sapiens emerge from the dust, hints of an ongoing wave. lapping slowly against the unknown. These were not empires. These were fragile clusters of kin, tied together by blood, need, and the desire to continue. And the Earth they stepped into was both familiar and strange. It was the late Pleistocene, a time of ice and warmth in equal tension, a planetary breath held between extremes. Vast glaciers crawled across the northern reaches, while tropical forests pulsed and retreated in rhythm with the planet's orbital cycles. Mammoths roamed, saber-toothed cats stalked. The Earth was alive but moody, shaped by orbital wobbles and solar whispers. In this place of shifting thresholds, Homo sapiens moved softly, not yet aware of how narrow the path truly was. They did not yet know they were fragile. Their numbers, though slowly growing, were still astonishingly small, perhaps no more than a few tens of thousands scattered across an entire planet. To them the world must have seemed endless, teeming with space and promise. Yet viewed from the calm distance of millennia, their existence balanced on a knife's edge. Every drought, every failed migration, every small misstep held the power to erase a lineage. Each band that vanished left no monument, no cairn, no echo, just a gap in the great tapestry of ancestry. In such a world, survival was not guaranteed. It was negotiated day by day between chance and persistence. The climate of that age was a patchwork quilt of instability. The late Pleistocene was marked by rhythm and rupture, ice advancing, ice retreating, rainfall shifting with monsoon patterns, and coastlines swelling and shrinking as sea levels rose and fell. Africa, though warmer than the glacial north, pulsed with its own hardships. Periodic droughts shrank lakes into shallow mirrors and turned grasslands into dust. Yet, these cycles of scarcity may have been what honed our ancestors. They learned to adapt, to improvise, to read the signs of an approaching change. And through it all, they kept moving. Movement was a kind of a language. It spoke of resourcefulness, of foresight, of faith that somewhere beyond the next ridge lay water or shelter, or the bones of an antelope. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans were already exchanging materials across vast distances. Obsidian carried hundreds of miles, shells from the coast found deep inland. Trade, or at least contact, had begun to weave invisible threads between distant groups. What must it have felt like to meet another band after weeks of isolation? To see faces not your own, and wonder, friend, stranger, reflection. They did not yet name themselves humanity. That word was still unborn, but they were already something distinct. Their tools, shaped with increasing precision, speak of minds that thought ahead, that planned, that dreamed. In stone and bone they began to carve continuity. The Acheulean hand axes of their ancestors gave way to more delicate flake tools, instruments of specialization. Technology, in its earliest form, was already rewriting fate. To hold a blade was to hold potential. And across their world, life hummed in harmony and danger. To the north, sheets of ice sprawled across Europe and Asia, trapping oceans in frozen prisons. In the south, rainforests thickened and thinned in tune with the earth's breath. Herds of giant buffalo roamed, and in their wake followed predators, lions, hyenas, early humans with sharpened sticks and firelit courage. They existed not apart from nature but within it, another species in the grand ecological rhythm, unaware that their story would someday rewrite all others. For now they lived in the slow pulse before the storm. And in that rhythm, a quiet unfolding began. With each passing generation, the world grew slightly smaller, not in size, but in mystery. The migration continued, hesitant yet persistent, following coastlines, rivers, and game trails. Some groups settled near fertile lakes, others wandered toward grasslands rich with promise. The humans who left Africa did not do so all at once. It was not an exodus, but a seepage. A slow diffusion of life, curious and unknowing, spilling outward across the continents. The line between exploration and survival blurred. Every step forward was both an act of expansion and a test of endurance. What guided them? Not maps or prophecies. Their compass was the same one etched into every animal. The search for sustenance, for safety, for something just beyond the horizon. Yet their movements suggest more than mere hunger. The archaeological record hints at symbolic behaviour: etched ochre, pierced beads, pigments gathered from distant places. This was not the behaviour of creatures simply trying to persist. This was the behaviour of minds reaching, wondering, shaping meaning from the world around them. In the shadow of mortality, they began to create permanence, but permanence was elusive. Each community was a flicker in the wind, fragile, temporary, easily extinguished by cold, by hunger, by miscalculation. A single generation lost to drought could end an entire lineage. Across Eurasia, Homo sapiens coexisted, and sometimes collided, with other human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others now lost entirely. These encounters, whether peaceful or hostile, further shaped the genetic and cultural landscape. We were not alone. Not yet. The world was still thick with possibility. Yet possibility is not protection. The further these early humans spread, the thinner their safety net became. Isolation meant vulnerability. In the African cradle, genetic diversity was highest. But each migration, each splintering group carried with it only a subset of that vast ancestral variation. A single mistake, a single environmental shift could undo years of progress. The margins for error were razor thin, the landscape was not forgiving, and there was no memory of what could go wrong, no myth of loss, no prophecy of fire. They did not yet know that a great darkness lay ahead, and perhaps that was a kind of mercy. To live unaware of the cataclysm to come is to live more fully in the moment. These ancient humans were not paralysed by fear of extinction. They were too busy living, too busy listening to the groan of mammoths, the crackle of dry grass underfoot, the whisper of a child breathing beside them as the stars wheeled overhead. They hunted, they gathered, they loved. They buried their dead and in rare moments painted their presence onto cave walls. And each act, each fire tended, each child born, was a defiance of the cold logic that said they should not endure. And yet, despite their resilience, they remained few. So very few. Even at their height before the cataclysm, Homo sapiens numbered less than a whisper in the planetary chorus. Perhaps 50,000, perhaps 100,000, scattered like stars across the dark plains of Africa and the southern fringe of Asia. Every individual mattered. Every family was a thread in a fragile weave. They lived on the edge of abundance, never quite secure, always negotiating with the land that both fed and threatened them. In such a small world, death was intimate. A failed hunt, an infected wound, a sudden flood. These were not statistics, but endings. Entire groups could vanish within a season, leaving no trace but footprints that the wind erased by dawn. And yet, even in this precarious state, they flourished in spirit. Their tools evolved in elegance and intent. They learned to pressure flake stone into finer edges, to craft needles from bone, to shape ochre into art. Each innovation was a whisper of foresight, a gesture toward an unseen future. They adorned themselves not out of vanity, but as an act of meaning, shells strung on sinew, pigments smeared across skin. To mark the body was to mark existence. It was as if, somewhere deep within them, they already sensed that the world was vast and that their time within it was small. The environment, though unpredictable, offered moments of grace. Africa's savannas pulsed with life after the rains. Herds of antelope and zebra stretched from horizon to horizon. Birds rose like confetti from marshland, and rivers bloomed with fish. Farther north, the edge of the Sahara breathed in and out with the rhythm of climate cycles, alternately swallowing and releasing green valleys. Even the deserts, brutal as they seemed, held secrets of sustenance known only to those who listened. These early sapiens were not conquerors of their world. They were students of it. Every storm, every drought, every birth taught them something new about balance. Still, the balance was delicate. Too much cold, and the rains would fail. Too much heat, and disease would spread. Their existence depended on harmony between distant forces, monsoons driven by ocean currents, winds shaped by continental ice, the subtle tilt of the planet's axis. The late Pleistocene Earth was a living organism, and humanity was but a nerve at its surface, sensitive to every tremor. They could not yet measure these patterns, but they felt them, in the murmur of leaves, in the behaviour of animals, in the way the air thickened before a shift in season. To live then was to live within the Earth's heartbeat, and that heartbeat was quickening. Subtle at first, a shortening of wet seasons, a thickening of clouds over the Indian Ocean, a faint haze above the mountains of Sumatra. The signs were there, faint and far away, long before the eruption, but no one could have understood what they meant. How could they? They had no concept of the Earth's core, no words for magma or pressure or caldera. They simply saw the horizon darken and thought it was rain. But before that first distant plume, before the rumble beneath the earth and the ash that would one day dim the stars, there was still life. Vivid, alert, unfolding. The world of Homo sapiens 75,000 years ago was not a primitive wasteland. It was a living map of possibility. Africa thrummed with ecosystems of astonishing richness. Baobab groves humming with bees, coastlines littered with shells, forests that whispered with the calls of colobus monkeys and hornbills. These were not nameless wildernesses, but homelands. Each bend in a river, each ridge of stone carried the memory of generations who had camped, hunted, laughed, and died there. For every fossil we find, there were countless lives we never will. Imagine a dusk in that age. The air still warm from the day's sun, the smell of smoke and damp grass rising as the first stars appear. A small band of humans gathers around a fire. The children trace figures in the dust. The elders murmur stories that blend memory with myth. Somewhere nearby, a mother rocks a child to sleep to the rhythm of crackling wood. Beyond the firelight, the night is vast, filled with sounds of insects, the soft sigh of wind, the occasional distant roar of something larger. They do not know the continents they walk across. They do not know the future they are making, but in that moment they are alive, and it is enough. Their migrations were not the march of conquerors, but the unfolding of curiosity. Step by cautious step they followed the tides, learning the habits of shellfish, the patterns of stars, the quiet promise of moonlight on open water. To move was not escape, it was exploration. Across the narrow straits separating Africa from Arabia, a few families crossed, perhaps using simple rafts, perhaps walking over exposed land bridges during glacial lows. From there, they spread like wind-blown seeds, travelling along the coasts of India and beyond. Their journey would take generations. The world they discovered was immense, alien, and at times cruelly indifferent. Yet, they adapted. Always, they adapted, and adaptation was their inheritance. It lay not in strength, but in awareness, an ability to watch, to listen, to change. That is what kept them alive in the long ages before the smoke. Small in number, yet infinite in potential, they wove themselves into the landscapes they touched. They learned which roots could heal and which could kill. They read animal tracks as sentences. They understood the meaning of silence. Fragile as their bodies were, their minds were vast, capable of holding entire worlds inside them. That, perhaps, is the truest prelude to what came next. The catastrophe that would nearly erase them was not the end of their story, but the crucible from which their humanity, our humanity, would emerge refined. For now, the night was peaceful, the air was clear, the stars were bright, and the fire still burned. But far beneath the feet of the early wanderers, deep beneath Sumatra's humid forests, its winding rivers, its green slopes where nothing yet seemed amiss, another fire burned in secret. Not a flickering warmth like the ones humans huddled around at night, but a pressure that had been building for hundreds of thousands of years, measured not in sparks but in silence. This fire did not ask permission. It did not speak. It waited. What does it mean for the Earth itself to prepare a catastrophe? To understand the eruption of Toba is to peer into forces far older and more indifferent than anything our species had yet imagined. Supervolcanoes are not like ordinary volcanoes. They are the culmination of vast geologic processes operating over unimaginable spans of time. Beneath Earth's crust lies a seething mantle, a slow-churning sea of rock hot enough to melt, heavy enough to crack continents. At tectonic boundaries, where plates collide and grind, that molten energy finds places to gather. Sometimes, instead of erupting quickly and releasing pressure bit by bit, the magma is trapped, unable to escape, accumulating in secret reservoirs beneath the crust. In the region now called the Sunda Arc, where the Indo-Australian plate dives beneath the Eurasian one, such a reservoir began to form. It filled slowly, invisibly, like a lung inhaling over millennia. Silica-rich and heavy with gas, the magma chamber beneath Toba became a hidden leviathan, and with every passing century the crust above it grew more strained. But to those living on the surface there was no sign. The jungle thrived, rain fell, clouds drifted peacefully above, and yet the earth beneath was quietly becoming a weapon. Could anyone have imagined it? That the very ground they walked on would one day vanish into sky? That mountains would collapse in an instant, replaced by a wound large enough to be seen from space? These early humans, scattered and vulnerable, could not have known, but the earth did. And slowly the balance tipped. When the eruption finally came, it was not the kind we recognize today. It was not a cone exploding or a single mountain venting steam. It was the violent emptying of a monstrous chamber, an explosive voiding of pressure that tore open the planet's surface. The eruption column may have reached 30 miles into the atmosphere. Pyroclastic flows raced outward in all directions, faster than sound, erasing everything in their path. And then came the ash, not just falling nearby, but carried on wind currents across continents. What happens when a mountain becomes air? It does not simply disappear. It spreads, it transforms, it invades. And in that transformation, the fate of the planet shifts. Toba was not merely a geological event, it was a planetary inhalation, the kind that precedes a long suspended silence, the kind that turns light into shadow, the kind that would change the meaning of time for every living thing on Earth. For the eruption of Toba was not merely large, it was nearly unthinkable in scale. An estimated 2,800 cubic kilometres of material were ejected in a matter of days, enough to cover entire countries in metres of ash, enough to bury regions alive, entire forests flash incinerated, rivers clogged with heat-glazed stone, skies turned into mirrors for the fire beneath. This was not an eruption. It was a planetary scar opening in real time, and still it did not stop. After the initial blast, the Earth began to collapse inward. The chamber, now emptied, could no longer support the weight above. Mountains folded, valleys vanished. The crust imploded, forming what would become the great caldera known today as Lake Toba, a wound 30 by 60 miles wide. In its wake, the atmosphere reeled. Ash climbed into the stratosphere, where it began to blanket the globe. Winds carried it west across India, north into China, even south toward Australia. It settled into lakes, into soil, into memory. But memory is not always immediate. For the humans who lived thousands of kilometres from the eruption, the terror arrived slowly. The sky dimmed, shadows lengthened even at noon. The temperature fell, not in a day but over weeks, then months. Crops withered before flowering, rain patterns changed, seasons collapsed into confusion. What began as geological fury became a global winter. How long can you live without a sun that warms? Scientific estimates vary, but many believe the Earth experienced a volcanic winter lasting at least 3 years. Some models suggest a global cooling of 5 to 15 degrees Celsius, with regional effects even more severe. These are not academic figures, they are extinction pressures. Photosynthesis halted, ecosystems buckled, food webs unravelled. It wasn't fire that nearly killed us, it was absence, the absence of warmth, of growth, of certainty. The absence of the world as it had always been. And amid this collapse, Homo sapiens, still new to the global stage, faced an existential bottleneck. What had been a slow but steady expansion became a desperate clinging to any place left untouched. The ashfall was thickest in South Asia, but the climatic impacts were everywhere. Only a few scattered populations, perhaps along coasts or in sheltered valleys, survived. What allows life to persist in the aftermath of cataclysm? Perhaps it is scale. The smallness of human bands made them hard to extinguish completely. Perhaps it is flexibility, the willingness to change, to abandon old patterns and try new ones. Or perhaps it is something deeper, something not yet understood, the instinct to carry fire forward, even through ash. What then does Toba mean to us, not only as an eruption, but as a mirror? In the long memory of Earth, there have been other volcanoes: Krakatoa, Mount Tambora, Mount St. Helens, Vesuvius, each a rupture in the Earth's skin, each powerful in its own right. But none match Toba's sheer magnitude. Krakatoa's eruption in the year 1883, for instance, was heard nearly 3,000 miles away, but it expelled only a fraction of Toba's volume. Mount Tambora, the largest eruption in recorded human history, triggered the famous Year Without a Summer in 1815. Yet it too was dwarfed by the scale of what happened in Sumatra 74,000 years ago. Toba was not the loudest scream, it was the deepest rupture. Its impact is not just measured in cubic kilometres of ash or degrees of global cooling. It is measured in the narrowing of our species, in mitochondrial DNA studies that suggest all living humans today descend from a painfully small number of ancestors who survived that winter, in the way our population tree pinches, a narrow waist in the hourglass of ancestry. And that bottleneck changed more than just numbers. It may have shaped who we are. What happens to a species that almost doesn't survive? There is some speculation, still debated, that this near-extinction pressure accelerated cognitive development. That those who endured had to adapt not just to scarcity, but to unpredictability. That the crucible of Toba selected for minds able to think abstractly, plan long-term, imagine futures in which the present could be changed. In that sense, the eruption may have played a role not just in shaping human population, but in sculpting human consciousness itself. The Earth, uncaring and ancient, may have shaped the inner life of our kind. And yet, for millennia afterward, the story was forgotten. There is no single legend we can point to and say, this is about Toba. No cave painting, no burial site, no ancient myth that names the volcano. Its memory was erased not because it was small, but because it was too large. It swallowed language before language had a chance to remember. Is it possible to forget something so vast it lives in the marrow? Perhaps not entirely. There are whispers, mythic fragments across cultures, of skies gone dark, of fire from the mountains, of long winters that reshaped the earth. And now, with the tools of geology and genetics, we can glimpse what those myths might be rooted in. The story has returned, not through voices, but through stone, through pollen, through the chemistry of ancient ice. The sleeping giant had stirred, and in that stirring, the human story nearly ended before it began. But what stirred it? What awakened such a force from slumber? The answer lies in Earth's architecture, in how tectonic plates collide and melt and grind. The region surrounding Toba is one of the most volcanically active in the world. The Indo-Australian plate is continually sliding beneath the Eurasian plate, a subduction zone marked by deep-sea trenches and towering volcanic arcs. As oceanic crust is pushed down into the mantle, it begins to melt, forming magma rich in gases, heavy in silica. It is thick, sticky magma, prone not to flow, but to explode. The longer it waits beneath the crust, the more pressure builds. Toba was not a sudden accident. It was a slow orchestration. Imagine it. Magma rising in pulses over centuries, forming chambers kilometres wide. These chambers expand, pressing upward against the crust, fracturing rock, releasing trace gases. At first, small earthquakes, then more frequent ones, then tremors strong enough to alter rivers. Eventually, the pressure exceeds the strength of the crust. A trigger, possibly a fault rupture, releases the built-up energy. The eruption is not singular, it is sequential. Phases unfold, each more violent than the last, culminating in the collapse of the land itself. It was, geologically, a perfect storm, but it was also one we did not witness, and that makes it no less real. We reconstruct it now from layers of ash in Indian lake beds, from sulfur spikes in polar ice cores, from microscopic shards of glass buried beneath the ocean floor. The clues are scattered like the eruption itself, distant, faint, but undeniable. What does it mean to piece together a disaster we didn't survive to describe? It means listening differently, reading not just what remains, but what is missing. The sudden absence of pollen in sediment layers, forests that failed to grow, the isotopic signatures that hint at plunging temperatures, the genetic silence that suggests whole populations vanished. Together, these traces form a negative photograph, a picture drawn in what was lost. And what was lost was staggering. Whole ecologies collapsed. Regions that once teemed with life went quiet. It may have taken centuries for equilibrium to return, and even then the scars remained. Toba did not just change the shape of the land, it reshaped time itself. History pivoted around it, even if it did so without a name. Could it happen again? That question lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved. The caldera beneath Lake Toba still breathes. It is quiet. It slumbers. But so did it before. The Earth is not finished, and supervolcanoes are not myth. They are memory, and they are possibility. And perhaps that is the most humbling truth of all. We walk a planet that remembers more than we do. A world whose silences are older than our oldest stories. The Toba eruption reminds us that beneath every forest path, beneath every mountaintop view, beneath the crust we call home, the planet is still dreaming, still turning its slow, indifferent thoughts, still holding the capacity for transformation beyond our comprehension. Toba was not an enemy. It was not a punishment. It was a release, an exhalation of stored energy, a realignment of buried pressures. In the scale of geological time, it was inevitable. In the scale of human time, it was nearly terminal. And yet, we remained. We remained to ask questions, to dig and measure and reconstruct, to look at the Great Lake in Sumatra and realize that we are staring into the throat of a past that once swallowed nearly all of us. We remain to wonder not only at how it happened, but why we were spared. Not as a chosen species, but as an improbable one, a creature of chance standing now in the light of its own remembering. What does it mean to know the Earth holds such forces beneath us? It means humility. It means awe. It means understanding that our survival is not guaranteed and never was. And in that understanding lies a kind of grace, a reverence not just for the quiet moments of peace, but for the long, churning silence that made them possible. Toba sleeps now. The caldera is filled with water. Tourists come and go, unaware of the fire still resting beneath their feet. But the Earth does not forget, and neither should we. Because to remember Toba is not to fear the Earth. It is to recognize our place within it, small, temporary, and astonishingly, miraculously, still here. It begins with a pressure that has forgotten how to wait. The magma chamber beneath Toba, swollen with centuries of silence, reaches its threshold. The crust fractures. Light and heat that have not touched air for 500,000 years surge skyward in a torrent of molten stone, ash and gas. The Earth does not break. It opens. A hole rips through the Sumatran landscape wider than imagination, a wound that bleeds fire. And in that moment, the silence ends. There is no warning that can prepare a world for this. There is no precedent to anchor the mind. The sky disappears in an hour. What was once blue becomes bruised, and then black, as clouds of ash rise higher than Everest, higher than thunderheads, higher than memory. The day dies before the sun sets. Forests incinerate where they stand, leaves curling and vanishing in the blast of pyroclastic fury. The sea recoils as shockwaves race outward, disturbing even the tides. The sky rains stone. These are not metaphors. These are physical truths. Pyroclastic flows, rivers of incandescent rock and gas, roar across the land faster than the speed of sound. Nothing escapes them. Animals do not run. They vanish. Trees do not fall. They dissolve. In the core of the eruption, temperatures soar to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Flesh, bone, earth, thought, all are equal in the face of this unmaking. In just a few hours, the very surface of the planet has been rewritten, and yet the eruption is not over. It expands. It multiplies. Fine ash, composed of pulverized glass and mineral, is thrown so high into the atmosphere that it begins a slow, global descent. It does not fall like snow. It lingers, suspended in the stratosphere, forming a grey veil that encircles the globe. For those in India, the ash arrives within days, a dust that settles on rivers, on rooftops, on skin. For those in Africa, it comes as a haze that dims the stars and chokes the breath. The ash is not death, but the memory of it. A drifting reminder that something has broken, something vast and unseen. What must it have felt like to look up and see no sky? In those first hours, the human heart must have wrestled with questions it had never learned to ask. Why won't the sun return? Why is the air so cold, so sharp? Why are the animals gone? The people closest to the eruption never had time to wonder, but farther out, those who saw the clouds build, those who waited for rain and were met with silence, their terror would have been slower. The fear would have crept in as crops failed, as the nights grew colder. As something once stable began to unravel, can a species sense when it is slipping toward a threshold it may not cross? Because what followed was not a single event, but a season of collapse. The explosion itself was over in days, but its consequences settled in layers. The atmosphere, once a medium for light and warmth, became a mirror of shadow. Sulfates and fine particulates reflected sunlight back into space. A volcanic winter began. Not with snow, but with absence. Absence of warmth, absence of pattern, absence of reassurance. Temperatures across the globe dropped by as much as 5 degrees Celsius. Rain failed, winds shifted, the cycle of the world began to stutter. And all across Eurasia and Africa the ash was there. A fine grey fingerprint on the bones of rivers, in the sediment of lakes. Across the cave floors that would one day hold human dreams in ochre and charcoal. These ash layers still exist. They are the forensic whispers of apocalypse. In India, geologists have traced them across the subcontinent, a band of glassy shards embedded in ancient soil, unbroken and unmistakable. In South Africa, thousands of miles away, microscopic ash particles have been found, preserved in sediments like ghost snow. The reach was planetary. The volcano spoke, and the world heard. But the ash did more than tell the story. It shaped it. With the atmosphere veiled in grey, photosynthesis faltered. Plants died. The herbivores that depended on them starved. The predators that hunted those herbivores grew desperate, and humans, already few, already scattered, faced a new and terrible challenge. Their maps of the world, drawn in memory and shared in fireside stories, no longer matched the land they walked. Paths that once led to water now led to dust. Valleys that once offered game now echoed with emptiness. The earth had changed its language. And what does a people do when the world forgets how to feed them? We cannot know their thoughts, but we can infer their movement. Archaeological evidence hints at abandonment, of caves, of hearths, of tools left behind as if flight became more important than possession. In some places, occupation layers vanish. In others, they shrink. Fewer fire pits, fewer artifacts, as if fewer hands remain to shape them. The silence of the archaeological record is not a gap. It is a scream muffled by time. The ash does not lie. And still, even in the darkest stretch of this long twilight, humans endured. Not everywhere. Not without loss. But somewhere, someone survived. In a cave perhaps, above the reach of the flows, near a spring that did not dry, sheltered in forests untouched by fire. They waited, they adapted, they told stories by smaller fires, and above them the stars hid behind ash, unseen, but still there. What does it mean to be human in a world that has forgotten the sky? It means reaching for meaning when the world offers only uncertainty. The night was darker now. The stars, once guides for hunters and symbols for myth, had vanished behind a ceiling of dust. The moon was a faint smudge, robbed of its glow. Even the rhythm of days was broken. Mornings arrived not with sunlight, but with a dull, bruised haze, and when the rains came, they were acid-touched, carrying the memory of the eruption into every root and stream. For those who survived, survival itself became a ritual. Fire was no longer just warmth, it was clarity. In the deep grey, flames became beacons, and around them, humanity gathered, drawing closer not just for heat, but for the fragile certainty of presence. A body beside you, a voice speaking through the dim. These became sacred. In the face of planetary erasure, intimacy became defiance. The emotional weight of this time is difficult to express, but not impossible to imagine. The confusion would have been constant. Why has the earth turned against us? What spirit has been angered? What sign have we missed? Across the continents, in languages we will never know, early humans likely asked these questions with aching hearts. Their gods, if they had them, might have seemed suddenly absent, their omens blurred. Rituals faltered. Certainty withered, and yet even in grief they remembered how to listen. The old skills of tracking, of interpreting wind, of reading bark and leaf and shadow returned with urgency. These were not luxuries, they were scripture, and slowly, painfully, in pockets across the globe some people endured, in caves sealed from wind, in coastal shallows where shellfish remained, in highlands that caught the last of the sun's warmth. These became the new cradles of our species. In those places memory persisted. The stories told must have shifted, from tales of plenty to laments of loss, from heroic hunts to survival epics. And maybe, just maybe, the eruption itself became myth before it had even finished speaking. A god of fire, a mountain that exploded in rage, a time when the sky forgot its name. These early humans may not have had writing, but they had voice, rhythm, metaphor. They remembered in song, in gesture, in repetition, and through those oral threads, meaning endured. What happens to a people when the past is lost, the present is chaos, and the future cannot be seen? They invent new beginnings. Slowly, from beneath the weight of ash and fear, the threads of resilience begin to weave again. Not all at once, not with clarity, but with instinct, with care, with the same persistence that once carried them across deserts, over mountains, through ice and drought. That same pulse, ancient, defiant, human, stirred again beneath the soot. Ecologically, the world staggered. Ecosystems collapsed and reformed. Species vanished and others took their place. In some places, grasslands returned where forests had stood. In others, wetlands dried into salt flats. The biosphere adapted, even if the scars would last millennia. And within that slow healing, the survivors found new footholds. They experimented, they improvised. New tools emerged, made from unfamiliar materials. New hunting strategies developed, adapted to a changed landscape. The world no longer behaved according to memory, so memory had to evolve. Geologists today can trace these changes not only in soil but in artifact layers. Microliths, tiny stone tools, appear more frequently. Their precision hints at innovation born from necessity. Symbolic objects too begin to emerge more widely. Beads, pigments, incised stones. Is it coincidence that creativity bloomed in the shadow of catastrophe? Or is that simply what humans do? Create meaning from fracture, art from entropy? Cognitive anthropologists have long debated when the human mind, as we understand it, truly emerged. Was it a slow dawn, a sudden awakening? Or perhaps, as Toba's veil darkened the sky, it provided the crucible for transformation. When the world became alien, our ancestors had no choice but to dream harder, to reach deeper, to imagine more fiercely. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold not just of survival, but of spirit. How do you rebuild a world that no longer remembers its own shape? The answer may lie in the intimacy of small acts. A mother teaching her child how to dig for roots, a father pressing patterns into wet clay, a sibling sharing food beneath a darkened sky. These gestures, quiet and continuous, became the architecture of renewal. The earth was altered, but not ended, and humanity, diminished but not destroyed, found its way forward by remembering what it meant to be together. And all the while the ash continued to fall, thin layers settling on hillsides, on riverbanks, in the hollows of ancient bones, each grain a witness, each deposit a page in the long book of the planet's memory. They would be buried, pressed into stone, waiting for future minds to read them. What stories will we find in the ash when we are ready to listen? We find a planet that blinked. A moment when the climate, the ecosystems, the atmosphere, and the living record of Earth paused, held its breath. The eruption of Toba did not erase humanity, but it did redraw the boundaries of what was possible. It created a bottleneck not just of population, but of possibility. From a genetic standpoint, humanity contracted. The mitochondrial DNA of modern humans carries the signature of that near erasure. It is as if the entire species walked through a narrow hallway of history, and only a few voices echoed through the other side. And yet, those voices carried enough. Enough memory, enough instinct, enough curiosity. The silence did not win. In the end, light returned. The ash settled. The sun, obscured for months, perhaps years, began to shine again through thinning clouds. Shadows returned to the forest floor. Seeds that had slept beneath scorched ground sprouted once more, and where there is green, there can be hope. The survivors, dispersed and disoriented, began the slow work of reconnection. Old routes were rediscovered, new lands were explored, and in time, new generations were born who would never remember the darkness, only the stories told about it. The fire that nearly ended us became, paradoxically, the fire that forged us. Not in body, perhaps, but in mind, in culture, in consciousness. It is easy to think of disasters as endings, but in deep time they are often beginnings in disguise. So what truly ended with Toba, and what began? We ended our innocence, perhaps, our sense that the earth was stable, benevolent, knowable. We began to understand that we are not passengers on a placid world, but participants in a volatile one. And through that realization, something changed. We became more than survivors. We became storytellers. And in those stories, of ash, of night, of strange skies and quiet miracles, we laid the first bricks of the civilization to come. Today, Toba sleeps again. Its caldera, now a lake, reflects the clouds as if nothing ever happened. Fishermen paddle across it. Children laugh along its shores. The trees have returned. The birds have returned. But beneath the water, the chamber still exists, still gathering, still waiting, and perhaps someday it will speak again. But if it does, we will remember. Not just with science or with data or with models, but with the deep old knowledge that once, long ago, we looked up at a sunless sky and chose to continue. What else in the end could be more human than that? The fire still burned, but now it gave no warmth. Its flicker was swallowed by the thickness of the air, the ash that refused to fall, the dark that no longer made way for morning. Above, the sky was not sky but a ceiling of soot, a lid placed over the world. Day and night blurred together into a greyness that drained the colour from the earth. There was no sunrise, no promise, only the memory of light. The Toba eruption was not a moment, it was a turning. The blast itself lasted days, perhaps weeks, a terrible crescendo of earth-shattering force, but its consequences unfolded with the slow certainty of a clock running out of time. Sulfate aerosols hurled into the upper atmosphere began to circle the globe like invisible ghosts. They reflected sunlight back into space, dimming the planet not just for days or months, but for years. Temperatures plummeted, rains failed, winds shifted, a volcanic winter had begun. What happens when the planet forgets how to warm? In the fossil record and in ice cores, the echoes of this change are preserved. Tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped within the frozen layers of Antarctica and Greenland, whisper of a world gone cold. They show a dramatic dip in temperature, perhaps 10 degrees Celsius in some regions, enough to unravel entire ecosystems. The trees stopped growing, grasses withered before they could seed. Animals began to migrate desperately or starve quietly. Species that had thrived for thousands of years suddenly blinked out, and among them, Homo sapiens, still scattered, still fragile, stood at the edge of absence. The earth became a stranger. In equatorial Africa, where warmth had always been a constant, nights grew bitingly cold. Rainforests shriveled into savanna. In India, where thick ash had blanketed the soil, the monsoon rhythm collapsed. Rivers ran dry, then flooded erratically, then vanished again. What had once been predictable, season, harvest, life itself, now came and went without pattern. Survival was no longer a skill. It was a miracle. And what did that miracle look like? Perhaps it was a child, wrapped in animal hide, shivering against her mother's side in a cave that no longer felt safe. Perhaps it was a hunter, returning empty-handed for the 4th day in a row, wondering how long they could go without meat. Perhaps it was the silence of elders who no longer told stories by firelight, because even stories could not explain why the sun had stopped rising. What must it have felt like to live in a world without dawn? Not only cold, not only hunger, but disorientation, a loss of meaning. Every plant, every animal, every river and sky had once been part of a pattern, part of a conversation between people and place. But now the earth had gone quiet, or worse, had begun speaking a new language, one not meant for human ears, one that no one could understand. And still, the ash fell. It sifted down like memory, slow and fine, covering the bones of trees, the empty burrows of vanished animals, the outlines of footsteps already fading from sight. It did not roar like the volcano that birthed it. It whispered. It gathered in hollows and rooftops, clung to eyelashes, seeped into lungs. It turned streams into sludge, soil into crust, sky into an unreachable promise. Across continents the world seemed suspended, caught in a long, breathless pause. But this was no ordinary silence, it was chemical, physical. In places as distant as Africa and India, thousands of kilometres from the Toba caldera, a strange dust began to settle. Thick layers of ash, sometimes 2 meters deep, blanketed the land. In the Jureru Valley of southern India, archaeologists would one day find stone tools frozen beneath these layers, tools made by humans who had once lived, hunted, perhaps even laughed here, their presence cut off by the sudden suffocation of Earth's breath, their fires extinguished not by rain or time, but by ash. Africa too bore witness. In the sediment of Lake Malawi, thousands of kilometres southwest of Toba, scientists discovered fine particles of volcanic ash that could only have come from that distant eruption. The implications are staggering. That a single geological event could paint the entire Indian Ocean basin in its dust. That one mountain collapsing in fury could shroud a hemisphere. But this was not just geology. This was experience. Imagine looking up and seeing no stars, no moon, no blue, only an eternal twilight, unmoored from the rhythm of sun and shadow. For early humans, whose very sense of time, of orientation, of ritual was tied to the heavens, this dislocation was not just physical, it was spiritual. When night no longer ended, when days dimmed into ash, how do you know when to gather food, when to bury your dead, when to hope? There is no direct fossil record of fear, but its traces live in the patterns we infer, the abandoned shelters, the thinning traces of tool-making, the sudden gaps in genetic diversity. Fear, it seems, can prune a species as surely as frost. And the frost came. Temperatures across the globe dropped precipitously. Some regions may have experienced 20 years of climatic instability. Glaciers expanded, deserts grew, rain belts shifted. In Europe, already in the grip of the Ice Age, the cold deepened. In the tropics, vegetation patterns transformed. The Earth's systems, interconnected and delicate, reeled like a body in shock, and through it all the people wandered, not in great migrations, but in cautious drifts, searching for shelter, for game, for anything that still grew, still moved, still offered warmth. The Earth had not ended, but it had withdrawn, its generosity gone quiet, its patterns broken. It was a world unrecognizable, not because it had changed in kind, but because it had changed in trust. And still, the ash fell. It fell into rivers that no longer flowed clean. It fell upon the backs of dying animals, on the brittle leaves of starving trees. It fell into the mouths of the living, whose every breath was a negotiation with dust. The planet had become monochrome. Even the air had a texture, heavy, metallic, alive with the faint sting of sulphur. Each inhalation burned a little, a reminder that the sky itself had turned against its children. The volcanic winter did not descend evenly. Some regions froze beneath grey clouds that refused to part, while others endured drought and dryness as rainfall collapsed. The equatorial belt, once a band of life and humidity, became fickle, sometimes flooding, sometimes parched. The balance of oceans and atmosphere, delicate beyond comprehension, had been upended. And everywhere ecosystems unravelled like loose thread. The great herds of grazing animals, antelope, buffalo, aurochs, dwindled as pastures died. The predators that depended on them vanished in turn. Forests that had stretched green and loud across continents went quiet. The songs of birds were replaced by the hiss of wind against ash. Insect life collapsed. The soil, robbed of sunlight and nutrients, grew sterile. For many species, extinction did not come as violence, but as forgetting, a slow, invisible fading from the record of existence. And in this fading world, humanity persisted, but barely. The fossil record cannot show despair, but the genetic record can whisper it. Studies of mitochondrial DNA suggest that our population may have shrunk to as few as 3,000 breeding individuals. Imagine that. The entire human story balanced on the will of a few thousand souls. A number so small that, had one more drought lasted a single season, the thread might have snapped completely. In caves and coastal refugees, people clung to what little warmth remained. They huddled together, sharing breath and stories, their faces lit by the faintest embers. Fire became both guardian and god. It was the only colour left in the world, the only proof that light had not abandoned them entirely. Perhaps it was in those moments, surrounded by darkness and silence, that humanity's deeper consciousness began to form, the realization that survival was not only physical but spiritual. That to live, one must also remember why. What did they dream of, those survivors in the long twilight? Did they dream of the sun, or had they forgotten its warmth? Did they pray, not to gods, but to memory itself, the echo of the world before? We cannot know, but perhaps we feel it still, that ancestral unease when storms blot out the sky, when days linger grey and unmoving. Somewhere in our blood lies the memory of those years, when dawn ceased to arrive and every new day felt like the same unending night. But now something else began to fall with it. Time. Not the regular measured time of sunrises and seasons, but a deeper kind. The slow crumble of continuity, the erosion of expectations. In a world where days brought no light and seasons bore no crops, the calendar collapsed. Rituals tied to planting and harvest became meaningless. The songs of birds did not return in spring because spring no longer came. It was not merely the earth that had changed, but the very idea of what time meant. The psychological toll of this suspended world is impossible to fully reconstruct, but we can imagine its shape. Early humans were not oblivious beings. They were observers, storytellers, creatures of pattern. They followed the stars, tracked the rhythms of migration, painted animals on cave walls not just to decorate but to remember. When those rhythms shattered, what remained? Perhaps some sought omens in the sky, trying to understand why the heavens had turned blind. Perhaps others ceased to look up at all, unable to bear the unfamiliar weight of a sunless firmament. The silence must have been staggering, not just the silence of absent birdsong or empty plains, but the inner silence, the one that comes when hope no longer knows what to cling to. Without the sun to mark a new beginning, each day must have felt like a repetition of the last. Grey, cold, still. Children born into the darkness would never know the true colour of the sky. Their first lessons would not be in joy or song, but in hunger and caution. The elders, once repositories of wisdom, must have watched helplessly as their knowledge, tuned to a world that no longer existed, became irrelevant. Stories about rain, seasons, animals and stars became stories about absences, a myth of the sun, a legend of warmth, and yet, even in this desolation life persisted. Somehow, against every probability, the species did not vanish. It is tempting to call this resilience, but resilience is not just endurance, it is transformation. These survivors, these few thousand humans clinging to scattered refugia, did not emerge untouched. Their memories were reshaped by shadow, their imaginations forged in scarcity, their bonds made sacred by shared suffering. If before the eruption humanity was a spark, now it had become an ember, small, buried, yet capable of reigniting when the world allowed it. The earth too was not still. Though cloaked in cold, its systems were recalibrating. Ocean currents shifted, aerosols gradually dispersed. And somewhere, faintly, light began its return. The volcanic winter would not last forever, but it had lasted long enough to mark a boundary. a line between before and after, between ignorance and awareness, between assuming the world would always be and knowing it could nearly not. But now, each flake that drifted from the sky marked the waning breath of a long catastrophe. Not an end, but the thinning of a veil. The world did not awaken all at once. There was no sudden return of colour, no chorus of birds to welcome a new day. Instead, the recovery arrived like a question, quiet, uncertain, unsure of whether it would be answered. The skies began to lighten slightly. Not blue, not yet, but less black. The thick, suffocating clouds of ash and sulphate slowly thinned, scattered by wind, diluted by rain. In some places, the rains were still acid dark, but they fell, and falling water means life. Where once the ash had choked every surface, tiny shoots began to push upward, tentative, pale, stubborn. Grasses first, then shrubs, and in time, forests would return, though not as they had been. For humans, the change was not immediate. Habits formed in the cold persisted into the warmth. Hunting remained scarce, food sources unreliable, populations did not suddenly rebound, they crept, they tiptoed. Genetic evidence suggests it may have taken thousands of years for the bottleneck to loosen, but the grip of extinction had been broken. Slowly, a breath was taken. And what of the memory? Those who survived the ash, and their children, and their children's children, carried no written records, but memory is not always written in words. It is written in myth, in the shapes of stories, in the caution that lingers in dreams. Across the globe, ancient traditions speak of long darkness, of skies choked with smoke, of ancestors who lived through fire and winter. Perhaps these are echoes, perhaps not. But if trauma leaves a scar on the species, then somewhere in our imagination, we still carry the shadow of that sky. To this day, layers of Toba ash lie buried across the Indian Ocean world, in lakes, in soils, in rock strata like quiet signatures, and in our own bodies, in the DNA passed down through unbroken lineages, is the trace of that near ending. Every person alive today is a descendant of those few thousand who endured, the ones who watched the sky go black and still chose to look forward, the ones who, in a world without dawn, became the stewards of morning. And so, the story of the Toba eruption is not only a tale of destruction, it is a meditation on fragility and persistence, on what it means to be alive when the world no longer welcomes life, on how small the fire of humanity once became, and how somehow it was never extinguished. The ash no longer falls, but its silence remains, deep beneath our awareness, like a hum beneath thought. Not a warning, not a prophecy, just a reminder. The earth does not promise, it only offers, and once, long ago, we almost said no. The story of humanity was almost silenced, not by war or conquest, but by a whisper in the blood. What happens to a species when its voice becomes faint, when its numbers fall not to zero, but to the ragged edge of possibility? Scientists call it genetic bottleneck, a moment when the variation within a population collapses, narrowed to a thread so thin it might have snapped. And it nearly did. Around 74,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens who walk the earth were reduced to what some estimates place at as few as 2,000 individuals. 2,000 out of a species that had once roamed from the coasts of Africa to the highlands of India, from forest edges to sun-bleached savannas. All the rich diversity, the interwoven families and rival clans, the stories that once moved like wind across the grasslands, nearly all were gone. How do we know? Not from bones, not from tools, but from something even quieter, the subtle patterns hidden in our cells. Mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, carrying a single thread of inheritance across tens of thousands of generations. Within that thread lies a signal, a strange genetic uniformity, a smoothing of the ancestral record, as if history had been scraped clean and begun again. Scientists call the central node in this network mitochondrial Eve. She's not a single ancestor in isolation, nor the first woman, but a metaphor, the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans, a whisper of continuity in a sea of silence. Does that mean she lived during the Toba winter? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But something happened then. Something that changed the shape of our inheritance. The lineages that once stretched far and wide were pruned down to a few survivors, clinging not only to life but to memory, to meaning, to one another. And so the map of the human family was rewritten, not by choice, but by absence. What does it mean to descend from such scarcity? To be each of us, the product of survivors who stood on the precipice and did not fall? It means that every human alive today and every eye, every heartbeat, every wandering thought is the result of that near vanishing. We are the future that those few once could not imagine, the improbable continuation of a story that almost ended in ash. And in that moment, the narrative shifted. No longer were we simply one species among many, expanding quietly across the world. We became something else, a lineage marked by erasure, defined not only by what we gained, but by what we lost. Whole branches of the human family tree disappeared without names, entire dialects, forgotten rituals, vanished art, all extinguished before they could leave a mark on stone. So what remained? Who were these few, these scattered embers in a world grown cold? What allowed them to endure when so many others faded into smoke? Perhaps it was geography. The earth, even in its coldest grief, left small sanctuaries, refugia, places where the grip of volcanic winter was weaker, where food still grew, where water still flowed. East Africa is one such possibility. There, along the rift valleys and ancient lakes, thermal activity may have softened the chill. Pockets of warmth, fertile oases ringed by volcanic soil, might have provided shelter for bands of survivors. The rift itself was no stranger to fire, yet its fractured geology also protected life from the very cold that had strangled other lands. Coastal regions, too, might have offered salvation. The sea, steady, vast, patient, became both refuge and provider. Along the edges of Africa and southern Arabia, small groups of Homo sapiens may have turned to the ocean's rhythm as their last teacher. Shellfish, seaweed, and stranded fish required neither tools nor seasons. When the inland rains failed, the tides did not. Perhaps it was here, where water met ash, that the idea of endurance was born. And then there is India, the land nearest to the catastrophe. In the southern subcontinent, evidence of human occupation persists even beneath the thick Toba ash layers. Stone tools, flake cores, hearth remains. They speak of continuity, of persistence amid the unthinkable. If these tools truly belong to Homo sapiens, they tell us that life found a way even within sight of annihilation. These survivors did not escape Toba. They lived through it. What does survival look like in a world so reduced? It is not triumph. It is not conquest. It is the long, thin thread of endurance stretched across generations. It is the sound of hands striking stones together in the dark, the repetition of familiar gestures even when the world has forgotten its patterns. It is the smell of smoke curling up from a small fire built beneath a cliff overhang, fragile, trembling, but alive. And in those fires something began to shift. The world outside had changed beyond recognition, and so the humans within had to change as well. Their movements became more deliberate, their cooperation more essential. To survive meant to rely on others not as rivals but as kin. The social mind, already forming, grew sharper in the cold. Bonds deepened. Empathy evolved not as philosophy, but as necessity. When the landscape itself turned hostile, companionship became the most valuable resource of all. So the few who remained became something new, not in form, but in function. They became storytellers of scarcity, inventors of meaning. For when the earth stops speaking in warmth and abundance, the only language left is that of imagination. They could not control the fire beneath the world, but they could kindle the one within. And from that fragile flame the story continued. But what did that story sound like when there were so few voices left to tell it? Across the scattered refugia, these remnants of humanity did more than survive. They remembered, not with writing, not with monuments, but with the oldest tools we have, gesture, breath, and repetition. The campfire became a place not only of warmth, but of transmission. And it is here, in this crucible of crisis, that we may begin to glimpse the deeper birth of culture, not as luxury, but as lifeline. When the outside world offered only fear, the inside world had to grow. Songs that once marked celebrations may have become lullabies against silence. Movement became ritual. Objects became symbols. A carved bone, a smoothed pebble, a rhythmic chant in the dark. Each held more meaning than its form. This is where the sacred may have begun, not in temples, but in the sheer improbability of endurance. To make something beautiful, however small, in a world that had almost ended. That was an act of defiance against the void. The cost of survival, however, was not only environmental or genetic, it was emotional, it was spiritual. These people, our ancestors, bore more than hunger. They bore the psychic burden of witnessing extinction, not of their species, but of the world they had known. The forests were different, the animals fewer. The skies, when they cleared, revealed constellations that must have seemed new. Everything familiar had shifted, and with it, the very axis of memory. We can never know the full weight of that grief, but traces of it echo in the way humans began to treat death, with attention, with care, with ceremony. The dead were no longer discarded or abandoned. In some sites they were placed in deliberate positions, sometimes with objects, sometimes with ochre, red as blood, red as fire. These gestures may have been offerings or comforts, or the first tentative steps toward the idea of an afterlife. What matters is not the meaning, but the meaning-making. In a world where nothing could be controlled, the human mind began to shape the unseen, and in doing so, it carved something permanent into the fabric of our species. Not a tool, not a shelter, but a habit of mind, to wonder, to fear, to hope. The ability to say, I am here, I remember, I imagine. This habit would become the root of every future myth and every future science. It would allow us to see patterns in stars and meanings in dreams. It would turn survival into story, and story into identity. It would be our inheritance, passed not through blood alone, but through firelight and silence. For when only the few remained, they carried more than genes. They carried the first embers of humanity as we now know it. This is the paradox of near extinction. It reduces, but it also refines. From the crucible of loss, something new emerges, leaner, sharper, quieter perhaps, but more cohesive. When populations shrink to the brink, their futures hang on the smallest of decisions. Whether to move or stay, whether to trust or turn away, whether to share or to hoard, each gesture mattered, each bond was magnified. The social web, always vital to our species, became indispensable. There's a kind of intimacy in these bottlenecked lives. These were not vast tribes with abundant resources and wide territories. These were clusters of kin and comrades, faces seen daily, voices known by heart. In such tight circles, survival depended on understanding, not only of the land, but of each other. The person beside you was not replaceable. They were water in the desert, heat in the cold, a second set of eyes in the dark. If they failed, so might you. And so, the emotional landscape of Homo sapiens shifted. Cooperation, already embedded in our biology, may have deepened into empathy. Conflict did not vanish, but its cost became higher. Across generations, this pressure may have shaped cognition, favouring those who could intuit others' needs, those who could comfort or coordinate, who could warn without words. The fragile society of survivors demanded emotional intelligence, and so, somewhere in this long night, our minds turned not just toward survival, but toward one another. This is not conjecture alone. Modern genetics reveals something curious. Despite humanity's global diversity, we are astonishingly alike. Compared to many animal species, even our close primate cousins, we carry less variation. This is the fingerprint of the bottleneck, the echo of that long-ago narrowing, when all the sprawling complexity of human potential had to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for continuation. But it is also the reason we can speak to one another across continents. Why empathy leaps oceans. Why the face of a stranger, though different, can still seem familiar. We are in a profound sense a family, and families when broken, remember. This genetic closeness binds us even now to those ancient fires. Their fear lingers in our caution. Their resilience echoes in our curiosity. their instinct to seek, to question, to dream. It burns on in every mind that wonders why. We may carry smartphones instead of flint tools, build satellites instead of stone circles, but the same questions flicker behind our eyes. Who are we? Where did we come from? And how close did we come to ending? We cannot answer fully. But in the silence left by those who did not survive, we find space to imagine and to honour. Because the cost of our existence is written not only in the stars, but in the absence of those who might have been. This is the quiet truth at the heart of the Toba story. It is not only a tale of volcanic fury or global catastrophe, but one of subtraction, of songs unsung, of languages that never formed, of futures that could have been. When we look at the map of early humanity, we see more than footprints. We see gaps, silhouettes of lost cousins, voices that might have shaped the world in ways we'll never know, and yet from that absence came us. To understand this is to live with reverence. Every step we take forward, into science, into culture, into art, is a continuation of a path nearly erased. That our ancestors survived the long dark of Toba's winter is not a given. It is a miracle of adaptation, timing, and fragile luck. And so, in every story we tell, we carry their shadows, the memory of narrowness, of cold, of almost. There is a kind of sacred humility in recognizing how small our beginnings truly were. Our cities rise, our networks expand, our knowledge grows by the hour. But at our core, we remain a species shaped by the void, not defined by it, but refined through it. The fewer we became, the deeper we grew. And perhaps that is why the human mind reaches so instinctively toward meaning. We are the descendants of survivors, yes, but also of mourners, those who knew what it meant to lose the familiar world. And so we build not only for comfort, but for memory. We erect monuments not only for pride, but for permanence. We dream not only of progress, but of connection, to each other and to those who came before. Even now, the genes of those few ripple through time. They are in your breath, in the curve of your ear, in the way your hands remember how to hold even before they are taught. They are not behind us, they are within us. We do not walk in their footsteps, we walk with them. So as this chapter of our journey closes, let us pause here, in the ashlit silence of survival, and listen. Not for the roar of fire or the thunder of collapse, but for the gentler sound that followed. The crackle of firelight in a stone shelter. The quiet murmur of a lullaby in the dark. The hush of a world that nearly ended, but didn't. Because they did not vanish. Not all of them. The story continued. And now it is ours. There are no words from 74,000 years ago that tell us what the sky looked like when the ash began to fall. No recorded cries, no carved memories. Yet something lingers. Not in stone, not in script, but in a deeper language. One carried in blood, in dreams, in stories whispered beside fires long after the firestorm itself had ended. What if memory is not only what we tell, but what we carry without knowing? The Toba eruption left no witnesses who etched their terror into walls, yet across human cultures there persists a rhythm, of fire from the heavens, of choking darkness, of floods that swallowed the world and began it anew. Are these echoes, coincidences, or the long genetic tremble of a species that once stood at the edge of non-existence? How do you preserve meaning when you have no words, no ink, no certainty that there will be someone left to listen? It is tempting to imagine that the survivors, those few who clung to life along coasts or sheltered in highlands, told stories. Not polished myths, but fragments, a flash of sky, the trembling of the earth, the moment the sun refused to rise. Passed from mother to child, from elder to infant, these would not be explanations. They would be warnings. They would be memories without structure, feelings passed on in cadence, in metaphor, in fear disguised as fable. What would such a memory look like, once centuries have worn away the literal and left only the symbolic? A flood that drowns the wicked, sparing only the chosen few. A God who sets the sky aflame, a darkness that tests the faith of mortals. These are not the memories of geologists, they are the memories of survivors, and though the details are fantastical, Their shape is familiar, too familiar. Mesopotamian tablets, Vedic hymns, Aboriginal songlines, Hopi warnings, all conjuring a cataclysm too large to fully grasp, all anchored by light swallowed by shadow, and life hanging by a thread. Could these stories, scattered across continents and generations, be the fossil record of emotion? For archaeology has its silences. It shows us layers of ash, tools buried suddenly, bones stilled mid-migration. But it cannot tell us what those bones feared. It cannot show the sound of a child waking to a world without sun. It cannot replay the heartbeat of a mother who saw the crops die before they bloomed. For that, we must listen differently. We must ask not only what happened, but what was felt. Is it possible that the trauma of Toba, the anguish of near erasure, became a drumbeat beneath the future of myth itself? Because when we fear the dark, when we stare into fire and feel both awe and unease, when we imagine the end of all things not as an idea but as a memory, what exactly is it that we're remembering? In every culture, fire holds a double face. It is warmth, protection, transformation, but also punishment, destruction, the final voice of gods in judgment. Prometheus stole it to awaken humanity. Shiva dances in its orbit. The phoenix is consumed by it only to rise again. Over and over, we build our worlds with flame, and we burn them down with it too. But beneath these tales may lie an older truth, not moral, not symbolic, but biological. Fire did not just cook our food, it reshaped our sleep, our eyes, our social lives, and once it may have nearly ended our species altogether. What happens when the very thing that defines your existence turns against you? The memory of the Toba eruption, if it survives at all, does not reside in precision. It lives in archetype: fire from below, ash from above, a sky that betrays, a season that never ends. These elements recur not as facts but as structures. Like bones of stories, they are buried beneath layers of culture and meaning. But dig deep enough, and the shape remains consistent. And then there is the darkness. The sun is central in nearly every mythology, giver of time, of life, of divine presence. What greater trauma then than its withdrawal? What more powerful image than a day that begins and ends in grey, then black, then silence? In some traditions, darkness is the beginning of creation, but in others it is a test, a punishment, a reckoning. The Egyptian sun god Ra must fight the serpent Apophis every night to ensure the dawn. In Norse prophecy, Ragnarok begins when the sun is devoured. In Christianity, darkness heralds judgment. What if these visions were not purely spiritual revelations, but echoes of lived experience, of generations that waited for light and found only cold? Even the motif of the flood, seemingly aquatic, may be elemental memory in disguise. Not all deluge myths describe water alone. Some speak of the sky weeping ash, of rivers choked with black. Could the waters of legend be a metaphor for the overwhelming, for the engulfing, for the world undone by forces that rolled over everything with the weight of the sky? And if so, what does that make myth? It makes it not a lie, but a vessel, a way of carrying the unbearable across centuries without breaking under its weight. It makes it a kind of fire itself, burning away detail, but leaving behind shape and heat. Can myth then be a form of survival? Not just of culture, but of sensation, of the felt truth behind the facts, in a world without books, where memory was skin-deep and bone-held, where voices were the only archives. Myth allowed continuity. It allowed pain to endure without consuming. It turned the scream into song. But what does archaeology say? It says very little. The earth is a slow speaker. It reveals in millimeters what was shouted in moments. In South Asia and East Africa, layers of volcanic ash lie atop stone tools and ancient hearths. They tell us someone was there, then they tell us they were not, and later, someone else returned. But the why, the how, those are questions left unanswered. There are no fossilized emotions, no strata for heartbreak, no sediment for hope. And yet the stories remain. And the similarities between them are uncanny, not in content, but in shape. Destruction, remnant, renewal. The trio of trauma, memory and rebirth appears again and again, sometimes divine, sometimes natural, always elemental, always intimate, a punishment that purifies, a darkness that clarifies, a silence that forces the heart to speak. Is this coincidence, or is there a code written in human memory that operates beneath language? Carl Jung called them archetypes, fundamental patterns of thought, behaviour and belief that emerge independently across cultures. And while Jung's ideas are debated, the pattern remains undeniable. Certain fears, certain hopes, rise again and again, like seeds buried deep, blooming only when the world demands it. Could the Toba eruption be one such seed? Its signature is global. Ash fell in India, thousands of miles from the caldera. The skies dimmed across Africa. Temperatures dropped across the planet. No tribe, no region was untouched. Even if the stories of that time did not survive in words, perhaps they persisted in shapes, inherited not through language but through culture's instinctual rhythms, the lullaby that mourns the light, the taboo around sky fire, the reverence for the dawn. Because when your ancestors lived through the end of the world, you do not forget. You teach your children to remember, even if they do not understand what it is they carry. Is that not what story has always been? A way of carrying what the body cannot hold. A form of time travel for feelings. A kind of shadow shelter in which the past breathes, unseen but unfaded. So what do we really mean when we say it was once dark for years? We mean that there was once a time when the earth itself withdrew its warmth, when the horizon offered no promise, when each morning came not with light, but with the dull ache of absence. We mean that the shape of grief was not yet poetry, but coldness, hunger, silence, and even then, memory found a way. Perhaps that's why fire became sacred, not only for its practical use, but for its defiance. In a world that had lost its sun, to hold a spark in one's hand must have felt like rebellion, like hope, like proof that not all light had left. Around it, stories were spoken, faces were seen, and the past could be reshaped, not denied. Even now, in modern rituals, and we see its outline. Candles lit in mourning and in prayer, bonfires on solstices, lamps floated down rivers to carry wishes or farewells. We reenact again and again the miracle of light surviving the dark. We do not call it Toba. We do not need to. The shape is enough, and so too with our fear of the sky. We build myths not only to explain, but to warn. That which descends from above, whether flood, flame, or God, is rarely kind. Why is that? Is it only projection, or is it inheritance? The silence of archaeology cannot answer. It can only gesture. To the depth of ash, to the absence of bones, to the retreat of tools. The rest, the whispers of meaning, must be pieced together through art, belief, gesture. A memory is not always something you can name. Sometimes it's a pause, a shiver at thunder, a child's question at dusk. A vision of apocalypse painted in strokes older than civilization. Is it any wonder, then, that even now our deepest stories return to endings? The Book of Revelation, the Kali Yuga, the Hopi cycles, climate narratives, asteroid impacts, nuclear winters. We are drawn again and again to the edge, not because we wish for it, but because we remember it. Somewhere beneath the layers of innovation and disbelief, we are still that species who watched the sky fall once and never fully recovered. And maybe that's why, when a volcano rumbles, when smoke rises, when the sun disappears behind the clouds for too long, we feel something ancient stir. Not panic, not logic, but memory. And what is memory if not the deepest kind of truth? It outlives accuracy. It transcends detail. It lingers where the facts have faded, in the beat of a drum. In the trembling voice of a storyteller who doesn't know why their tale begins with fire, but tells it all the same. That is the memory of Toba. Not recorded, not conscious, but cellular, cultural, carried across generations like a hidden scar, unseen but shaping the way we move, the way we listen, the way we look to the sky. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we do not need a carved tablet or a preserved manuscript to know that the earth once tried to end us. We feel it, in our caution, in our awe of mountains, in our reverence for light, in the strange silence that descends during a thunderstorm, as if the air itself remembers something older than language. When the clouds roll low, when the birds fall quiet, when the smell of ash is imagined though no fire burns, that is when we remember. Not with our minds, but with something deeper. Because somewhere, long ago, a child watched the sky go dark and asked, "Will it ever come back?" And someone answered, not with certainty, but with a story. And the story became a tradition. And the tradition became a myth. And the myth became the way we remembered what the wind had erased. In this way, extinction became narrative. Despair became rhythm. The silence of the sun became the music of the hearth. And now, tens of thousands of years later, we sit around different fires, electric, glowing in our hands and walls, yet still we gather, still we tell. The names have changed. We speak of apocalypses, collapses, tipping points, but the cadence is the same, and the fear, and the question, how close are we to the edge? It is not melodrama, it is inheritance. Even in science we seek stories. The layers of ash, the drop in temperatures, the migration patterns halted mid-step. These are not only data, they're fragments of a sentence we're still learning how to read. And at the heart of it all is the human thread, the part that wonders, remembers, creates, and survives. So when we speak of the Toba Catastrophe, let us not speak only of magma and soot, of climate and carbon. Let us speak of lullabies, of myths born in the cold, of a memory so deep it no longer needs words to endure. We are the descendants of those who did not vanish. And in every story we tell, whether sacred or scientific, flickers the ember of what they could not say. And that ember, against all odds, still glows. The ash did not clear all at once. It drifted, settled, lingered in soil and bone and sky, a grey veil across the bruised face of the earth. And in the scattered shadows of this aftermath something ancient persisted, walking upright, thinking, fearing, feeling. We did not die, but we were no longer who we had been. What does survival do to the shape of a mind? Those who endured were not chosen. They were not stronger or better or more deserving, but they were different. They lived in small groups, clinging to heat and memory. They spoke more, watched more, remembered more, and in the deep silence after the fire they listened. The earth had roared, and they had heard it. Now came the long waiting, the slow path through hunger, cold, and isolation. A journey not across distance, but through transformation. How do you rebuild when the world no longer feels safe? For those few thousand Homo sapiens who navigated the broken landscape, adaptation was not just physical, it was mental. The old world was gone, familiar migration routes were ash-choked, trusted hunting patterns failed, new strategies had to form, faster. Those who thought creatively, who shared ideas, who coordinated rather than competed, were more likely to endure. In this crucible, something sharpened. A form of cognitive flexibility emerged, not as a plan, but as an instinct. The mind began to loop through possibilities, play out futures, imagine before acting. Thought became a survival tool, not just a luxury, but thought alone could not mend what the sun had unmade. Communities that remained did not grow larger, they grew tighter, bonds deepened. Care for the injured became essential. Cooperation was no longer a choice, but a condition of existence. A fractured social group meant death in the cold, and so emotional awareness became more than empathy. It became infrastructure. The architecture of survival was trust, and beneath that trust, grief. Because to continue meant to carry the names of those who didn't. The uncles and cousins, the storytellers and scouts, the unborn children. Those who remained walked roads made from silence and absence, and on those roads they changed. When the forest no longer offered fruit, they shaped tools to dig roots. When the rivers swelled or dried, they learned to watch the sky. Each decision was a response to crisis, but together they created something larger, a pattern of invention, an upward spiral of necessity, and that spiral would not end with survival, because once the mind begins to adapt, it does not stop. Once a species learns to imagine a better future, it begins to shape it. So the question is not how Homo sapiens endured, but what that endurance cost and what it made possible. What kind of human is born in the echo of catastrophe? One who remembers before remembering, one who sees not just what is, but what could be. In the long silence after Toba, that seed of symbolic thought, once a spark, became flame. The archaeological record stutters in these years, but where there are gaps in stone and bone, there are patterns in the way we began to dream, carvings, paint on cave walls, ornaments shaped not for function, but meaning. It begins here, not in a burst but in a whisper. The dawn of symbolic behaviour. Could it be that trauma unlocked the door? When survival depends on cooperation, shared language becomes a tool of survival. But not all communication is literal. Gestures, metaphors, shared ritual, a mark on a rock that says we were here, or more haunting still, someone was lost. These are not tools for hunting, they are tools for remembering, for belonging, for creating a world more bearable than the one outside the firelight. The first bead of shell, worn around the neck, the first ochre-streaked wall, the first rhythm of drums beneath stars. We may never know exactly when they emerged, but the conditions that nurtured them were forged in fire and ash. And perhaps this is the strange irony of catastrophe, that it clears the ground for something new. If we could watch those early humans as they knelt by riverbeds, examining flakes of stone, or gathered around the heat of fire to share stories no longer tied to the present, would we recognize them? Would their eyes reflect something familiar, the glimmer of abstraction, the ache of remembering? Did grief create art? Because symbolic thought is not just invention, it is expression. It is the moment when a tool becomes a sculpture, when food becomes offering, when gesture becomes ritual. And this transformation is not trivial, it is everything. It marks the line between animal and ancestor. And yet, it did not happen all at once, or everywhere. Some groups may have returned to older ways, reusing known tools, retreating into cycles of survival, but others, perhaps shaped by longer winters or deeper losses, leaned into change. Innovation bloomed along uncertain paths. What must it have felt like? The first time a child traced their hand on a cave wall and saw it echoed in ochre. What must it have meant to carve a figure in wood or stone and not just see an object, but a memory, a presence, a story? In these moments, the human mind turned inward and then outward again. It asked not just, how do I survive, but what does this mean? And in that question, fragile, open-ended, powerful, a new kind of future was born. But it did not arrive gently. It was shaped by constraint, sculpted in scarcity. The trauma that pressed down on those scattered survivors was not just environmental, it was generational. And as the climate slowly began to right itself, the mind bore the imprint of all it had endured. What does it mean for a species to carry collective trauma? Not in the way of memory, not as a conscious recalling of the fire or the cold, but deeper, in reflex, in fear, in the ways we build families and tribes. The Toba event may not live in legend, but its echoes live in instinct, in the caution we feel around new terrain, in the reverence we grant to fire, in the way we cling to community even when it hurts. Evolution does not sculpt only the body, it reaches into emotion, into cognition. It favours not only stronger muscles or keener eyes, but more attuned responses. Sensitivity becomes a strength, so does patience, so does doubt. And in this crucible, we began to form minds not just capable of remembering pain, but of using it. Pain became information, and that information became tradition. We often speak of trauma as something to be healed. But what if it also built us? The nervous system of Homo sapiens may have adapted not just to threats, but to the anticipation of loss. We learned to plan, to hedge, to imagine danger before it arrived. Anxiety became a survival mechanism, and so the inner world grew more complex, and perhaps more difficult to carry. But with complexity comes creation. The mind that can imagine risk is the mind that can imagine hope, a future, even a better one. And hope, once imagined, becomes a compass. It guides migration, it fuels invention, it births rituals, not just to mourn the past, but to call forth what does not yet exist. So perhaps this is the deeper inheritance of Toba, not despair, but resilience, a kind of sacred anxiety, the knowledge that the world can break, but we do not have to. How do you live, knowing how fragile it all is? You build things anyway. You shape spears from bone. You teach your children to listen. You paint the stories they are too young to understand. And in that teaching, in that act of passing forward, you become something else, not just a survivor, not just a witness, but a messenger. And the message, whispered into the ash road behind you, is simple. We endured. And endurance changed us, not just once, but in every generation that followed. Because survival was no longer simply a matter of food and shelter. It became a question of identity, of orientation, of meaning. What kind of beings wake each morning in a world that once nearly ended? Beings who prepare. The descendants of Toba survivors walked with a different awareness. They tracked the movement of stars. They watched seasons with more precision. They paid closer attention to the shape of clouds, the tilt of the sun, the warning in a bird's cry. Knowledge was not hoarded. It was distributed, shared in the circles of kin and kin of kin. And through this sharing, culture deepened. We began to create systems, not only of tools, but of thinking. We refined language, ritual, and memory. We marked the passage of time not only by moons, but by meanings. A burial became more than disposal. It became grief. A song became more than noise. It became memory. A tool became more than function. It became teaching. And in this web of meaning, new neurons fired. The human brain did not grow in size after Toba, but in wiring, in efficiency, in creativity. We shaped multiple futures in the theatre of the mind and chose the ones that might serve us best. Imagination became strategy, and strategy, paired with collaboration, became civilization in embryo. Because this is the paradox. Collapse does not always end a story. Sometimes it begins one. After the ash, we became something else, not just individually, but collectively. Not just smarter, but more integrated. We formed tighter groups, more consistent social bonds, and those bonds became the lattice for something vast. Culture. Culture is what emerges when biology alone is not enough. It's how we adapt faster than genes. It's how we preserve what the earth might erase. It is memory externalized, in dance, in scar, in symbol, in fire. And fire, above all, remained the centre. Around fire, we told, we remembered. We watched shadows stretch across stone and imagined gods, monsters and ancestors, all rising from the same coals that once saved us. We learned not to trust the warmth blindly, but to treat it with respect, because we had seen what happened when the fire came from the mountain instead of the hearth. That fear, that reverence, seeded something lasting. Even now, we sense it. In our stories of destruction, in our warnings of apocalypse, in the tension between awe and dread. The future became real to us only after we almost lost it. So we began to build futures deliberately. We shaped our tools with foresight. We passed down warnings disguised as myths. We taught our young not just how to eat, but how to imagine. And in this imagining, we took our first steps toward becoming fully human. Not just ashwalkers, not just survivors, but shapers of destiny. Because in the wake of destruction, there is always a choice, to forget or to remember, to repeat or to reimagine. And for those who stepped onto the ash road, remembrance became a tool just as powerful as fire. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the earliest signs of symbolic culture, beads, pigments, burials, music, intensify not long after the Toba eruption. Not because the eruption caused art, but because it demanded meaning. The world was no longer predictable, and meaning became a way to survive what could not be understood. In that search for meaning, we found each other. The isolated became interdependent. Groups that once split apart under stress began to fuse. Stories carried across rivers became bridges. Songs echoed across caves became identity, and those who shared meaning most effectively became ancestors. This wasn't the end of hardship, far from it. But it was the beginning of something new, a humanity that didn't just adapt to the environment, but adapted the environment to itself. We began to plan dwellings, track herds, leave behind deliberate markers for those who would come next. We became teachers of time. And the ash road, though invisible now, remains beneath us, not in the soil but in our structure, our sociality, our dreams, our restless yearning to understand the forces that shape us. That road leads from fire through language, through memory, to now, and still we walk it. In every warning carved into modern myths, in every story of flood, flame or fall, Toba is there, silent, unnamed, but echoing. In every instinct to gather, to prepare, to protect the fragile bonds of community, Toba is there, and in every ritual, every shared meal, every vigil kept through dark and storm, Toba is there. We may never find a single cave painting of a volcano, but we find fire in every human culture. We find the memory of change encoded not just in our genes, but in our behaviours, our caution, our curiosity, our craving for stories that bind. So let us remember, catastrophe is not the enemy of culture. It is the forge in which culture is tested, and those who stepped onto the ash road carried with them more than wounds. They carried futures. Futures full of music and mourning, of invention and adaptation. Futures shaped by minds that had stared into darkness and survived not only by instinct, but by insight, by imagination. The world that followed Toba was not one of certainty, but it was one where humans, the few who remained, chose to think, to create, to endure not in silence, but in story. And in that choice, made again and again, over tens of thousands of years, the ash road turned to path. The path became a journey, and the journey became us. They did not wait for safety. They did not wait for comfort, or plenty, or peace. They began to carve, to paint, to bury their dead with beads and ochre while hunger still whispered at the edge of their fires. They made meaning while survival was still uncertain. Why? In the cold shadow of the supervolcano, when the earth was still healing and the skies still wore a veil of dust, something ancient stirred within the minds of the survivors. Not just the urge to endure, but the urge to express, as if catastrophe had unlocked a new chamber in the architecture of the human soul, one that did not merely want to continue living, but needed to say, I was here, I remember, I matter. We find the traces, not in great monuments or towering idols, but in the flicker of red ochre smudged across stone, in bone carefully tucked into shallow earth, in tools shaped with elegance beyond utility. These are not the marks of desperation. These are the first sparks of culture. What does it mean to make art while the world still groans from the weight of ash? What does it mean to mourn when death is so frequent, so ordinary, it might as well be a season? It means that even then, especially then, humans reach for something higher than survival. 70,000 years ago, somewhere in southern Africa, a hand pressed pigment into the wall of a cave. Was it a message, a ritual, a plea? We may never know, but we can imagine a fire burning at the entrance, the smell of smoke curling into the night, and a small gathering of survivors not just warming their bodies, but tending to something deeper. Memory, belief, beauty. The Blombos Cave in South Africa offers one of the earliest known glimpses of this kind of thought. Etched ochre blocks with crosshatched designs. Deliberate, abstract, symbolic. These are not the chaotic scrawls of accident. They are intention made visible, pattern for the sake of pattern. The first sign that the human mind was no longer satisfied with reacting to the world. It wanted to reflect on it. And as time passed, this reflection deepened. In the Levant, burials appear with grave goods, shells, tools, pigments. In Indonesia, hand stencils bloom across cave walls like ghostly declarations of presence. And in the cold caves of Europe, tens of thousands of years later, lions and horses would gallop across stone in ochre and charcoal, drawn with precision and awe. What made this change happen? What unlocked the floodgates of the human imagination? Was it the trauma of the near extinction? The narrowing of populations to just a few thousand, huddled in coastal refuges and surviving by ingenuity and cooperation? When all is nearly lost, what becomes precious? Perhaps the eruption of Toba was not only a bottleneck of biology, but a crucible of meaning, a filter through which only those who could adapt, not just physically, but cognitively, emotionally, passed through. And what they carried with them was not just genetic code, but new stories, new symbols, new selves. What happens when the sky falls, and yet the human spirit endures? You begin to sing, you begin to paint, not for food, not for shelter, but for something less tangible, the need to externalize thought, to make the invisible visible, to give form to fear, to joy, to memory. Perhaps the first pigment smeared across cave stone was not meant for others at all, but as a conversation with the self. A gesture toward coherence, toward holding on to something in a world that had nearly come undone. The earliest signs of symbolic behaviour weren't grand. They were small, intimate, and deeply human. In a coastal cave near what is now Morocco, archaeologists unearthed perforated shells stained with red ochre, beads perhaps strung and worn. Not utilitarian, not edible, but beautiful. Ornamentation had entered the human story, and with it, a declaration: I am more than just a body, I am someone. Around 70,000 years ago, we see this pattern repeat in Africa, in the Levant, in India. Burial sites become more deliberate. Bodies are not simply left behind, they are placed with care, sometimes with ochre, sometimes curled as if sleeping. Objects accompany them, tools, animal bones, pigments. This is not instinct. This is reverence. It is mourning. It is the first echo of spirituality. In these gestures, culture is born not out of abundance, but out of loss. A child dies and is buried with a carved antler. An elder fades and is laid to rest beside a shell necklace. These are not random. They are stories told without words, emotions woven into action. They reveal a mind no longer governed solely by instinct, but by symbol. The great misconception is that culture arises from surplus, that once we had enough food and safety, we turned to painting, music, and myth. But perhaps it is the other way around. Perhaps culture is what kept us alive when the world was broken. The caves at Kafsi in modern-day Israel offer haunting evidence of this. Among the remains of early Homo sapiens, children are buried with deer antlers placed carefully across their bodies. Not for use, not for food, but for meaning. And in that meaning we see something profound, the beginning of symbolic mourning, and perhaps the beginning of symbolic hope. Because to bury the dead is also to affirm the living. It is to say, your life mattered, your death changed us, and we remember. These acts, these symbols, these first fragile sparks of culture speak to a shift not just in how we lived, but why. The world after Toba was still harsh, unpredictable and cold. But it had awakened something that no ice or ash could smother. The desire to leave a mark, a fingerprint of the soul, a trace of thought in a world that no longer guaranteed tomorrow. And so we painted, we carved, we buried, we sang, and in doing so we kindled a fire deeper than any hearth. A fire of the mind, a fire of meaning, a fire that would never go out. It flickered in the corners of damp caves where the walls became more than stone. They became canvas, memory, sanctuary. And over time, this flame grew. It leapt across continents, across generations, carried in story, in rhythm, in the careful chipping of stone that became more than tool. It became art. The symbolic mind was now awake. Somewhere in Sulawesi, Indonesia, around 45,000 years ago, a hand was pressed to a cave wall and outlined in ochre. It still lingers there, ghostly and bold, a red negative imprint that says nothing and everything. I was here. That simple gesture, the outline of a hand, is among the oldest surviving declarations of self. It is not a map, not a warning, not a hunting guide. It is presence made visible, and beside it, animal figures begin to appear, wild boars, a Noah, figures half human and half beast, not only observed but imagined. This too is new, to dream of what is not and to put it into the world. In Europe, some 10,000 years later, in the Chauvet and Lascaux caves, horses and lions leap across stone walls with energy and elegance. The animals were not painted as mere biology. They were painted with movement, with spirit. The caves were not homes. They were temples, spaces set apart, places where sound echoed and torchlight danced, and in that shifting light so too did the imagination. What compels a people scraping survival from a harsh landscape to retreat into darkness and depict the world in pigment? It is not leisure, it is ritual, it is longing. It is an act of memory and of projection, of recalling what was and invoking what might be. The first storytellers were not entertainers. They were shamans, guides through the invisible. The painters of those ancient walls were not decorators, but visionaries. And the world was changing again. In the wake of the Toba bottleneck, as populations stabilized and even began to expand, humans carried more than tools with them. They carried myths, they carried motifs, they carried the practice of marking the world with meaning. We see abstract symbols carved into bone, repeated across regions. We see consistent shapes and forms, spirals, zigzags, crosshatches, symbols whose meanings we cannot translate, but whose repetition hints at shared understanding. These are not random scratches. They are language not yet made into words. This is the rise of symbolic communication, a prelude to writing, to ceremony, to law, to identity. And through it all, one truth whispers beneath the data. Something profound happened in the wake of near annihilation. A convergence, a leap. The same brain, yes, but a new mind. A mind tuned to metaphor. A mind that could hold paradox and memory, dream and death, fear and beauty all at once. And in the echo of every cave painting, in the silence of every grave, we can still hear that new voice murmuring, I see, I feel, I remember, I am. And that recognition of the self as both fragile and enduring becomes the heartbeat of culture. It is echoed not just in caves or graves, but in the structure of community, in the rhythms of ritual, in the slow shaping of identity that would ripple outward for tens of thousands of years. Because once a species knows itself in this way, as both mortal and meaningful, the world is never the same again. The trauma of survival forged more than just memory. It forged a hunger for coherence, to live through the collapse of climate, to watch familiar landscapes die and family lines vanish, was to be pressed into a new kind of question. Why did we survive? And what must we do to remain? This was not just adaptation. This was interpretation. A shift from reacting to the world to trying to understand it, and to understand oneself within it. Symbolic behaviour, from the careful burial of the dead to the marking of territory with ochre handprints, may well have been a kind of psychological glue. It bound groups together, reinforcing identity and belonging in a world rendered unstable. Those who could share meaning, who could collectively remember and collectively imagine, were perhaps better equipped to persist. In this way, early culture may not have been optional, it may have been essential. The archaeological record hints at this invisible thread. We see toolkits grow more diverse. We see ornamentation become more intricate, not merely functional, expressive. Across regions and populations, objects begin to carry stories. A bead is no longer just a bead. It is a marker of affiliation, a symbol of mourning, a promise of love, and that symbolism, once kindled, grows. Consider the rise of musical instruments, flutes made from bird bone found in the Swabian Jura, dating back at least 40,000 years. These are delicate, precise, and profoundly unnecessary in a purely survival-based economy, yet they exist, because sound too is a kind of meaning, a way to share emotion without language, a way to connect across silence. It is tempting to view these developments as gradual, inevitable, but there is nothing inevitable about meaning. It is chosen, carved, painted, breathed into life. And perhaps it was the enormity of loss, the feeling of nearly vanishing from the earth, that sharpened that choice. Perhaps it wasn't comfort that gave rise to art, but the absence of it. In the long dusk of the volcanic winter, humans may have reached toward beauty not because they had everything, but because they had almost nothing. It was a form of defiance, of remembrance, of healing, to bury the dead with ceremony, to press a hand against a cave wall, to carve a spiral into stone. These were not acts of decoration, they were acts of survival, of a different kind, acts that said, in the face of darkness, we are still here, and we are more than what we eat. This realization that humanity had crossed a threshold not just of survival but of meaning marks one of the most profound transformations in our species' story. In the flicker of torchlight on limestone walls, in the whisper of wind over burial sites, a new kind of human was emerging. One who did not merely endure the world, but interpreted it. An interpretation, once born, expands. Out of the silence left by the volcano, the first mythologies may have grown, not yet in words but in images, rituals, in gestures repeated across generations. Fire became not just warmth, but symbol. The cave became not just shelter, but sacred space. The hunt was no longer only about meat, but about rhythm and memory and respect. We cannot hear these first songs, we cannot read these first myths, but we can feel their presence in the echoes left behind, in the ochre patterns that reappear across continents, in the carved figures buried with care, in the convergence of aesthetic and spiritual impulses long before the written word. And always, there is the shadow of catastrophe behind it, because when a species is nearly erased, when life is pared down to its thinnest edge, the things that remain take on greater weight. Those who survived the long night of Toba did not forget it. Not entirely. They could not. It lived in their caution, in their gatherings, in their need to explain the world and their place within it. This is why the cultural explosion that followed the Toba bottleneck is not merely a coincidence of archaeology. It may be a legacy of trauma, of resilience, of redefinition. To see this is not to romanticize suffering. It is to recognize that out of pressure, new forms emerge, that the human mind, stretched by loss, did not collapse. It widened, it deepened, and in that deepening something extraordinary took root. Culture, true culture, is not just about beauty, it is about continuity. It is the mechanism by which memory is carried across generations, encoded in symbol and story and ritual. It allows us to outlive our bodies, to transmit more than DNA. And in this transmission, we become something more. We become a people who do not merely die, we mourn, who do not merely eat, we share, who do not merely live, we remember. The ash of Toba scattered across continents, but from its shadow, these sparks of meaning caught and held, and in them, the first embers of what we call humanity glowed quietly in the dark. Not yet nations, not yet history, but something even more powerful, imagination. And imagination, once kindled, does not fade. It burns forward, in songs, in symbols, in the handprint on stone, a soft, steady signal to the future, from those who survived the fire, and became more than they were before. It begins not with celebration, but with quiet, a silence stretching over tundra and tree line, a hush that followed a long, cold nightmare. After the world darkened and the sky turned to ash, after the hunger, after the unthinkable losses, there were still those who endured. They did not know how few they were, perhaps fewer than 10,000. They did not know what they had become, the fragile thread from which all future humanity would be woven. But they knew the earth had changed, and so must they. It was not survival alone that defined them now. It was the will to move again, to seek again, to remember the shape of a warmer wind, the scent of distant berries, the echo of past rains. And so they began to walk. Slowly at first, then with momentum, Homo sapiens expanded once more into a waiting world. The glaciers had begun their slow retreat, revealing lands that had been buried beneath ice for generations. New corridors of grass and stone emerged from the thaw, and people followed them, step by step, season by season. This was not a march of conquest, but one of remembrance and renewal. Along the river valleys of what we now call the Levant, small bands gathered, camped, hunted, sang. In the uplands of the Caucasus, families traced the old paths of mammoths and reindeer. Across Central Asia, they fanned out like seeds scattered by wind. Who were these early migrants? Not conquerors, but custodians of a deep memory. They carried in their bones the weight of extinction, and in their eyes the glint of something harder to define, a caution, a patience, a resilience born of near erasure. The journey across Eurasia was not swift, nor uniform. Some groups stayed close to coasts, where the rhythm of tides promised predictable sustenance. Others ventured into high forests, chasing the herds that had also returned with the warming, and everywhere they went they left behind more than footprints. They left ochre-stained stones, beads shaped from shell, burials dug with care. The map of their expansion is written not only in artifacts but in our very blood. Genetic evidence traces these ancient pathways like the faint veins on a leaf. From a single lineage, reduced in diversity, narrowed by catastrophe, new branches emerged. Populations split and diverged, yet all carried echoes of the same ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mothers, whispers of a shared origin in East Africa and of a rebirth in the aftermath of fire and ice. Y chromosome markers sketch parallel lines, revealing how fathers and sons too marked their return across the continents. The data speaks softly but clearly. Something profound had changed in the human genome after the bottleneck, not just in number, but in possibility. Traits once rare became common. Genetic drift shaped language, skin, immunity. Mutations once isolated became the norm for entire regions. How does a species remember hardship in its very cells? How does trauma leave a signature not only in story but in biology? Perhaps the answer lies in the peculiar tenacity of our minds. Those who endured the long winter were not the strongest, nor the largest, nor the fiercest. They were most likely the most adaptable, the ones who cooperated best, who shared, who listened, who grieved together and hoped together. Psychological resilience became a survival trait, and as generations passed, this mindset embedded itself not only in behaviours, but in cultural memory, the whisper that danger lurks in excess, that the world can turn cruel in an instant, that no fire burns forever. What does it mean to rebuild after loss so total that even its memory fades? What parts of ourselves do we owe to ancestors who endured without understanding what they had survived? Even today, the shapes of our fears carry shadows of those ancient years. The dread of sudden darkening, the instinct to store food, the reverence for the sun's return. These may be more than superstition. They may be echoes, reverberations of the age when humanity was almost no more. And so, as the ice withdrew and forests grew tall again, Homo sapiens did not merely spread. We transformed. We became storytellers of survival, architects of meaning, carriers of fire. And though the paths we walked diverged across continents and generations, one truth remained embedded in all our stories. We had come close to the end, but we endured. And it is this endurance, quiet, persistent, almost invisible, that may be the most important inheritance we carry. We did not merely evolve in the biological sense, but in the imaginative sense. To suffer and survive is one thing, but to understand that suffering, to encode it into stories, to prepare for its return even generations later, this is something deeper. Across early Europe and Asia, signs of increasingly complex behaviour appear not in a sudden burst, but in a slow unfurling. It is not simply that our tools improved, though they did. Stone blades became finer, more varied. Hunting strategies became more coordinated. Campsites showed signs of the longer habitation. But beyond these markers of practical adaptation, something else moved beneath the surface. There are sites in modern-day Turkey, Armenia and Georgia where circles of stones appear not as fortresses, but as places of gathering, shared fire pits, aligned post holes, small figurines buried in pits. These were not signs of battle or brute survival. They were signals of community, of connection. Groups once scattered began to develop shared practices, not uniform but resonant. Across distances too great to permit daily contact, there were echoes, similarities in ornamentation, in how bones were arranged in graves, in the pigments chosen for adornment. A web of continuity wove itself across the ancient world, and that web, however fragile, helped people navigate the post-catastrophe wilderness. What spurred this thread of cohesion? Perhaps it was the recognition that no one survived alone, that in a world prone to darkness and cold, the only reliable heat came from others. Trust, that intangible currency, became essential. And with it came ritual, not yet religion in the organised sense, but the beginnings of pattern. Seasonal dances, remembered chants, carved signs. These acts stitched individuals into groups, and groups into something more durable. Shared memory became the scaffolding for identity. As Homo sapiens pushed into the unknown, forests untouched since the glaciers, highlands full of new beasts, they did so carrying not just tools, but stories. In these early narratives, hardship was never far away. Many involved journeys, hunger, the threat of the skies. It's tempting to see them as primitive entertainment, but they were more than that. They were survival strategies encoded in metaphor, warnings disguised as tales, maps of meaning that helped make sense of a world still healing from an invisible scar. For the children born after the ash, the world must have seemed cold and sparse, but within the rhythms of their kin, within the chants of their elders, there was continuity. Something had come before, something had survived, and in knowing that, they could move forward. This is the quiet legacy of those who endured, not merely existence, but understanding. An inherited intuition that hardship does not end a story. It deepens it. It compels us to adapt, to gather, to speak. Across the broad plains and river valleys of Eurasia, the movement of people was no longer just a slow response to the shifting climate. It had become a quiet momentum of resilience. What had once been isolated bands were now budding networks, bound together by shared ancestry and emerging traditions. Genetic studies show that population numbers, once dangerously low, began to rise. Slowly, cautiously, the bottleneck relaxed its grip. From those scattered remnants, the human story unfolded anew, not with triumphant fanfare, but with steady breath and repeated steps. Groups expanded into previously uninhabited regions, re-entered abandoned lands, and left behind traces not just of survival, but of growth. Migrations flowed northward as glaciers receded, and into Europe they came, not in waves of conquest, but as carriers of fire, memory, and new ideas. This re-expansion is etched into our very DNA. In the mitochondria of our cells and the branching patterns of our chromosomes, we carry the signatures of those first few who endured. Genetic drift, the random shifts in gene frequencies that occur in small populations, had been accelerated by the near extinction. Some lineages were lost forever, their unique variations gone with them. Others became dominant simply because they happened to be carried by those who survived. This founder effect reshaped the genetic map of our species, laying the foundation for much of the diversity we see today. Yet beneath that diversity lies an unexpected uniformity, a deep kinship that links people across the globe, a quiet echo of the time when there were so very few of us. As the population grew, the challenges changed. No longer was the primary question how to survive the next winter. Now it became how to live with one another, how to organise, to share, to protect what had been regained. These questions were not answered through logic alone, but through emotion, intuition, and the shaping of shared experience. It is here that we begin to see the first signs of the social mind expanding, not just to include family, but strangers. Not just to remember dangers, but to anticipate futures. In the flickering light of communal fires, stories were told not only to entertain or instruct, but to bind, to remind each listener of the silent past that clung to their ancestors, to warn them, in ways that facts never could, of what happens when the sun disappears and the soil gives nothing back. This instinct, to embed memory and story, to wrap danger in myth, is not a luxury. It is a survival mechanism, and it may be one of the most important tools ever created by our species. As Homo sapiens spread further into the recovering world, that instinct to remember through story evolved alongside the communities themselves. In some regions, stories were etched into stone or painted onto the walls of caves. In others, they were woven into the cadence of dance, passed from lips to ears, generation to generation. These weren't simply tales of monsters or miracles. They were cautionary constellations of memory, designed to help people adapt not only to the world they saw, but to the one they feared might return. The volcanic winter may have ended, but its shadow lingered in the architecture of the human psyche. Even as forests returned and rivers swelled with new life, the memory of scarcity lived on, not in words, but in behaviours, in how food was shared, in how strangers were greeted, in the reverence for fire and warmth and light. This inheritance shaped more than just our fears. It shaped how we organised ourselves. Archaeological evidence suggests that post-bottleneck groups began to place greater emphasis on cooperation, division of labour, and the sharing of resources. The oldest communal hearths, storage pits, and cooperative hunting tools all appear not long after the worst of the volcanic winter. These were not only practical innovations, they were expressions of a worldview recalibrated by near annihilation, one in which survival meant being part of something larger than the self. To lose the group was to lose the future, and yet, within this interdependence, creativity blossomed. Freed just enough from the shackles of pure survival, human minds began to explore not just how to endure, but how to express. The remnants of this awakening are subtle but profound. Geometric etchings on bones, rows of punctured beads made from snail shells, the first signs of musical instruments. Such artifacts do not emerge in a vacuum. They are the fruits of minds shaped by suffering, but not broken by it. Minds seeking not only food and shelter, but meaning, connection, and beauty. This drive to make sense of the world, to impose order on the chaos left by the catastrophe, may have helped accelerate the development of language itself. Complex communication, always a strength of Homo sapiens, may have taken on new dimensions in the crucible of recovery. Coordinating hunts, transmitting skills, retelling experiences, all of these would have demanded increasingly sophisticated forms of expression. And with language came something else, the ability to remember together, to build collective memory that transcended any one individual. In this way, the trauma of the past became not just a scar, but a seed, planted deep in our consciousness, watered by ritual and story, and growing into the vast canopy of culture. As people moved farther apart, these roots still connected them. Separate groups carried variations of the same myths, the same fears, the same rituals, evidence of a shared history now stretching across thousands of kilometres. Even in their differences, echoes rang out between them. Across the Eurasian steppe and into the highlands of what would one day be Europe, disparate bands of Homo sapiens developed burial rites that honoured the dead with ochre, beads and antlers. Along distant coasts, children were laid to rest in positions of care, cradled by shells and carved ivory, signs that grief, too, had become a shared language. These were not mere responses to death, they were affirmations of continuity. When a life ended, something was carried forward. Memory, perhaps, or lineage, or simply the refusal to let the world forget. The survivors of the Great Silence were not just adapting to a new climate, they were cultivating a new kind of humanity, one built as much on shared meaning as on shared blood. That is why the legacy of those who endured is not only written in our genes or traced in our bones, it pulses through the very frameworks of our societies. The impulse to gather around fire, to mark the turning of the seasons with story and song, to build myths from darkness and light. These are not cultural accidents. They are inheritances shaped in the furnace of crisis. They speak of ancestors who knew the fragility of the world and who responded not with despair, but with imagination. For them, every painted handprint, every buried charm, every sung refrain was a declaration, we are still here, and so they pressed onward. From the warm savannas to the ice-laced forests, from river basins to mountain passes, Homo sapiens did not just move, they remembered as they went. Even in isolation, memory endured. It curled inside lullabies whispered to children under unfamiliar stars. It shimmered in the gleam of a carved stone passed from hand to hand. It survived in the caution with which food was stored, in the reverence for light after a long night, in the hush that sometimes fell when the wind rose, as if the past was stirring again, reminding, warning, whispering. To endure is not only to live, but to carry forward something that was almost lost. Those early humans, the mothers and sons, the wanderers and weavers, became the foundation of a lineage that would one day write poems, launch ships, map the stars. But their most extraordinary act was not any of those future feats. It was choosing to go on when the world had nearly ended, choosing to speak when silence had seemed eternal, choosing to begin again. We are their descendants, carriers of their burdens, beneficiaries of their wisdom. The world has changed many times since that long winter, and will change many times more. But deep within us, buried like the embers of a long-dead fire, there remains this truth. Once, we almost vanished, and still, we endure. The story begins not in legend, but in layers. Layers of ash, layers of ice, layers of silence. For centuries the world forgot what had happened, or perhaps never knew. The skies had cleared, the forests returned, and humanity walked onward, unknowing. But beneath the feet of farmers, buried in the sediments of lakes and frozen into polar ice, the truth had been waiting to be read. What does it mean when memory fails but matter remembers? When the earth itself holds the record of what we once could not speak? In the last few decades, that memory has begun to resurface, not in myth, but in measurement. It started with anomalies, sharp spikes of sulfur found deep in the ice cores of Antarctica and Greenland. Each layer, like a page in a frozen book, spoke of a sudden cooling, a brutal winter that did not belong. Trees, too, told their version. Stunted rings in fossilized trunks, abrupt interruptions in growth, and then came the ash. Across the Indian Ocean basin, across the subcontinent, even in layers beneath African soil, a thin, silvery grey fingerprint was found. The chemical signature matched, always the same origin, a singular eruption on the island of Sumatra. Mount Toba, long quiet, had once screamed loud enough to mark the bones of the earth. But what human ear had heard it? What human voice had survived to tell? Not many, it seems. The genetic trail, subtle, mathematical, undeniable, points to a population narrowed almost to the breaking point. Yet the question haunted the data. Why had we forgotten? If this eruption was so vast, so transformative, why did no oral tradition seem to name it? Why no ancient story clearly preserved its fire? Science does not always wait for folklore to confirm its findings. It proceeds by excavation and inference, by isotope and shard. Yet here, the absence was striking. For so long, it was used as an argument against catastrophe, a quiet skepticism, suggesting that what left no myth must have left no mark. But science listens not just to what is said, but to what is missing. In the silence of our oldest stories, in the gap between myth and rock, something waited. And then came Lake Malawi. Sediment cores, drawn up from the lake bed like scrolls from the deep, revealed a transformation. A sudden shift in pollen, forests replaced by grasses, then nothing. The plant life had vanished, followed by animal life, followed by silence. It did not last forever. Slowly the ecosystem recovered, but the dip was there, unmistakable, a mirror to the ice cores, a shadow beneath our feet. And still, there were questions. Did all regions suffer equally? Were there refugees that escaped the worst? Did humans flee, adapt, die quietly in forgotten valleys? Absence does not always mean annihilation. But the echo was loud enough to hear if you knew where to listen. This is the paradox that haunts deep time. What happens when the evidence is subtle, but cumulative? When 100 whispers become a roar, not through volume but through harmony? The Toba eruption is no longer in doubt, its magnitude confirmed, its reach immense, but its human toll remains partially veiled. This is not the fault of science, nor of myth. It is the nature of survival. Catastrophe rarely leaves tidy ruins. It leaves scattered bones, altered genes, the quiet recalibration of species. And so we walk atop the ash, unaware. We speak languages shaped by bottlenecks, hold beliefs passed down by survivors, all while forgetting what exactly we survived. How many other shadows lie beneath our feet, waiting not to be remembered, but to be found? But that silence, that great forgetting, would not last forever. In the 20th century, science developed new ears with which to listen. These were not ears tuned to language or story, but to the chemistry of ice, the layering of mud, the whisper of isotopes buried for eons. From Greenland to Antarctica, ice cores were extracted, cylinders of time stretching hundreds of thousands of years into the past. And within these frozen archives, a pattern began to emerge. A dramatic spike in atmospheric sulfur, a sudden drop in temperature, a band of dust that spoke of a global veil. Around 74,000 years ago, something vast had unfolded, altering the sky itself. The same was found in lake sediments across Asia, in the quiet mud of Lake Malawi, in the floors of Indian reservoirs. Layers of fine grey ash lay like fingerprints pressed into the earth. Geologists, cross-referencing the particle sizes, mineral composition, and depth of deposit, traced them back not to a local fire or passing wind, but to a singular origin. Toba. The eruption had flung its ash over continents, blanketing forests and plains thousands of kilometres away. What oral tradition could compete with that kind of silence? What memory could hold such distance? And yet, even with mounting geological evidence, the pieces did not fall into place easily. It was not until the patterns in our own genomes were compared, the bottlenecks, the sudden genetic homogeneity, that the implications crystallized. The eruption wasn't just massive, it was consequential. Profoundly so. But for decades, the connection between ash and absence, between geology and genealogy, was dismissed as speculative. After all, there were gaps in the fossil record, no mass graves, no signs of widespread fire damage to bones. In science, absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, and this is where the tension lies. A tension not unlike the one that defines myth itself. We have the ash, we have the sulphur, we have the genetic contraction, but we lack the screaming headline, the single burial site with a sign that says, "This is where the Toba dead lay." What we have instead is inference layered upon inference, pattern matched against probability. And here, the scientist becomes almost like the mythmaker, not creating stories, but assembling possibilities from fragments. A genome becomes a text, a sediment layer a verse, a crater, a silence between lines. That we ever uncovered this event at all is a testament to how deeply we can see and how much we still miss. The Toba eruption, in its scale, its subtlety and its shadows, forces us to reckon with the blind spots of knowledge. Not just what we know, but how we come to know. And perhaps more hauntingly, what we still don't see, buried beneath our feet. Because science, for all its rigour, must begin with what can be touched, measured, confirmed. Yet the story of Toba pushes against the limits of that framework. It is an event written not in bold scars, but in whispers. There was no Pompeii, no frozen tableau of lives interrupted mid-step. There are no ash-entombed villages, no mass fossil beds of animals curled in sudden death. What we find instead are absences, gaps in pollen counts from ancient lake beds, where forests abruptly stopped flowering, gaps in genetic diversity, where once there was variation, gaps in occupation layers at archaeological sites, as if entire regions were simply vacated. And in a discipline built on presence, those absences became contentious. Did the eruption really cause a global catastrophe? Or was its impact more regional, more survivable? Could Homo sapiens, already adaptable, already spread thin across varied environments, have weathered it more resiliently than assumed? These questions sparked debate, sometimes fierce, among volcanologists, paleoanthropologists, geneticists. Some argued for a volcanic winter lasting decades, plunging global temperatures and collapsing ecosystems. Others pointed to evidence of continuity, stone tools that did not cease, bones that still appeared in cave strata after the presumed devastation. The tension reveals a deeper truth. Our methods are brilliant, but incomplete. We peer backward with flashlights into a canyon of time, catching only what reflects. And sometimes, what is most important is what fails to reflect at all. The silence in the archaeological record is not an emptiness. It is an enigma, a prompt. It invites us to widen our methods, to include not just the layers of dirt and ice, but the possibility of cultural reverberation, hints of catastrophe preserved not in bodies, but in behaviours. Consider the sudden shifts in toolmaking that follow the Toba period. Microlithic technologies, small, sharp, composite tools, begin to appear more widely. Symbolic expression becomes more complex, more geographically widespread. Is this coincidence? Or is it a trace of transformation, a survival strategy born in the crucible of collapse? Some researchers suggest that what we're seeing is not just human continuity, but human reinvention. That Toba did not destroy us, but distilled us, pressed our scattered traits into a new synthesis under pressure. That idea, that catastrophe can create as well as destroy, adds a poignant note to the forensic record. The ash, the sulphur, the cold. These were not just markers of death, they were the raw materials of evolution. In surviving Toba, humanity may have crossed an unseen threshold, one not marked by bones or fire pits, but by cognition, foresight, memory. The birth of a deeper kind of self-awareness, forged not in leisure but in necessity. And while no test tube can prove such a leap, the patterns suggest something happened. A silence, followed by a song in a new key. That new song echoes not just in stone and bone, but in the subtle resonances of behaviour and story that came after. It is in the persistence of fire rituals across cultures that never met. It is in the emergence of sky watching, of sacred mountains, of myths about smoke and sun and silence. Long before we uncovered the ash of Toba beneath the earth, we may have carried it in our fears, the dread of a sky that does not return to blue, of a moon veiled too long, of a sun that dies. The forensic record is silent on such emotions, but culture remembers in ways more tenacious than sediment. And yet, we must tread carefully. Correlation is not causation. It is tempting, almost too tempting, to stitch every change in human history to a singular disaster. But the story is more complicated, not a straight line from eruption to enlightenment, but a tapestry of reactions, delays, adaptations. In some places, perhaps, the effects of the Toba eruption were more survivable, buffered by geography, by season, by sheer chance. In others, devastation may have been near total, and it is in that unevenness that humanity's true adaptive capacity is revealed. We did not endure uniformly, we endured diversely. This is why some lake beds show continued pollen deposition, suggesting plant life rebounded quickly in certain regions. Why some stone tools show no break in style or production, while others vanish and are replaced. Toba's reach was global, but not absolute. And this partiality complicates the search for a singular narrative. It is not just the eruption we must understand, but the patchwork of human experiences that followed. Some must have seen the sun vanish and never rise again in their lifetimes. Others perhaps saw it return and framed that return as a sacred miracle, worth preserving in chant and rhythm. So how do we speak about such an event? One that left the world altered, but not ruined, that nearly ended us, yet may have made us more human? The answer lies in embracing ambiguity, in honouring both what the data shows and what it suggests. Ice cores give us temperature graphs. Sediment layers show ash thickness. Genomes reveal contractions and dispersals. But none of these capture the full truth. That truth lives between the disciplines, in the intersections of climate science and cultural anthropology, of genetics and storytelling. To study Toba is to stand at a crossroad, looking not for a single path, but for the echo of many. The shadows beneath our feet are not only physical, they are metaphorical, psychological. They represent the limits of what we can know and the humility required to stand before those limits. And perhaps, in acknowledging those boundaries, we step closer to a fuller understanding, not just of what happened, but of how it shaped the quiet, enduring miracle that is us. The final irony is that the event which nearly erased us is one we forgot. No ancient inscription names Toba. No carved monument records the darkened skies. The greatest eruption in 2 million years, and it passed into silence. It is only now, through drilled cores and mapped genomes, through cross-continental data and the patient layering of clues, that we begin to glimpse it. And this, too, is part of the human story, that we are a species capable not only of surviving catastrophe, but of rediscovering it tens of thousands of years later. Like archaeologists of our own oblivion, we brush away the soil of time and peer into a crater long, cooled, still echoing. This rediscovery comes with a kind of weight. To know that we are descended from those who stood at the brink is to inherit more than DNA. It is to carry a legacy of fragility and strength, a paradox that humbles and steadies. We often think of ourselves as masters of the world, architects of destiny. But Toba reminds us that we are also, irrevocably, children of the Earth's moods. The ground beneath us is not fixed, the sky above is not promised, and yet we built meaning from that uncertainty. Perhaps it is no coincidence that our greatest intellectual achievements, science, philosophy, art, arise from a need to impose pattern on chaos, to find continuity where nature offers none. The same drive that once looked to the horizon for returning herds now scans sediment layers for volcanic glass. The same impulse that once named gods of thunder now calculates the sulfur load in prehistoric ice. What we lack in memory, we compensate for in curiosity. And so the Toba eruption, long buried, long silent, becomes not just a geological event, but a mirror. In that mirror we see both our vulnerability and our capacity. We are reminded that extinction is never far, but neither is resilience. That knowledge comes at a cost. It unsettles. It forces us to confront how narrowly we avoided vanishing, but it also equips us. Because to know that we have walked through fire is to know we can again, though never without loss, never without transformation. The past is not only prologue, it is blueprint. And so we walk on, beneath skies that once turned black, over ground that once cracked and seethed. We walk with the ghosts of those who did not continue, and with the silent gratitude of those who did. Beneath our feet the ash remains, quiet, buried, waiting. Not a threat, but a reminder that even in the deepest dark something stirred, that even at the edge of extinction a spark held on, and that from that spark we came. The fire did not make us strong. It did not select the best or the brightest. It did not reward virtue or punish flaw. It burned indiscriminately and left behind a narrower world. But in the narrowing, something happened. Not a purification, not an ascension, but a transformation born of proximity to the edge. For we had come close to vanishing, and in that closeness we were changed. What does it mean to almost not be here? To teeter on the boundary between existence and Raya, not once but again and again across time. Survival is often mistaken for victory, but survival is quieter than that. It's not triumphant, it's not loud, it's not inevitable. It is trembling and uncertain. It is the moment you open your eyes and realize the sun has risen, when you didn't expect it to. And from that silence, from that cold awakening, humanity stood and began again, not because we were chosen, but because we remained. In the long arc of planetary history, our presence is less than a blink. We are recent, fragile, and profoundly contingent. And yet we often tell our story as if it were destined, a march of progress, a rising line from stone to steel. But history does not march. It wavers, it trips, and sometimes it nearly ends. The eruption of Toba was not the first crisis, nor the last, but it was among the most severe, a crucible that shrank the human world to a scattering of firelit caves and salt-bitten coasts. It left no pyramid, no inscription, no written lament. But it left an imprint all the same, in our genomes, in our fears, in the shapes of our stories. How different would our species be, had the ash fallen slightly heavier? Had the winds curled another way? Had the survivors not found each other in time? These are not idle questions. They are reminders that our continued existence is not a monument, but a question still being asked. We tell ourselves that we are exceptional, and in many ways we are. But our exceptionality is not armour. It is responsibility. To know that we were not guaranteed, that we emerged from a narrow gate into a wider world should change how we walk through it. It should teach humility, and perhaps reverence, for the thinness of the line we follow, for the countless near ends we do not remember, but still carry within us. What does it mean to carry forward when you have almost been erased? To build again not from abundance but from absence. To imagine not because you are safe, but because you remember danger. These are the philosophical embers left by the fire that nearly unmade us, and yet we did not stop at surviving. Something in us looked back into the darkness and then turned forward. Why? Why not remain small, hidden, cautious? Why, after coming so close to the edge, did we step out again into the unknown? What part of us refuses to stay silent after silence? Perhaps it is the same part that shaped our earlier songs, those soft rhythmic pulses we sang in the dark to soothe each other, to mark the return of light. The same part that traced fingers along cave walls, that buried the dead with shells and ochre and meaning. We are not only a species that adapts, we are a species that reflects, that memorializes, that names the unknown even when it terrifies us. And this too may be part of the legacy of Toba, that in coming through fire, we came to need more than warmth and food. We needed story, we needed purpose, not in grand orchestrated mythologies, not yet, but in the quiet way a parent explains thunder to a child. Or a clan elder describes the movement of stars. The fire forged not only our fear, but our awe. For to survive is to endure the arbitrary. To live while others perish, to be spared without reason, this is a burden as much as a gift. And in the wake of Toba, those few who remained may have felt that burden in their marrow. Not guilt, perhaps, but awareness, that life could vanish at any time, and that its preservation was sacred. This sense of sacredness, not tied to gods or temples, but to the very act of continuing, seeded the roots of meaning. We began to treat life as something not just to be lived, but honoured. And in doing so, we became more than survivors. We became stewards. This shift is subtle, but profound. The difference between living through something and learning from it is the foundation of culture. We did not merely persist after the eruption. We evolved, not only biologically but ethically. Slowly, haltingly, we developed a sense of interconnectedness. That one's survival was bound to another's. That memory was not a luxury, but a necessity. In the ash-covered landscapes of the post-eruption world, we began to look not only at the ground, but at each other. What do you know? What do you remember? How did you make it through? In those exchanges, something deeper than knowledge passed between us. It was a kind of trust, the understanding that survival is shared. This is why the fragility of our early history matters, because fragility births awareness, and awareness can birth wisdom. The tools we shaped after Toba were not only sharper, they were more varied, specialized, communal. Innovations like tailored clothing, shared shelters, portable hearths, they emerged not just from need, but from an expanded understanding of what it meant to be human. We had faced extinction, and from it we carried not only the scars, but the strange gift of perspective. Not the arrogance of dominion, but the quiet resolve of those who have seen the abyss and stepped back. We became, in some small way, philosophers of survival, not in words, but in how we lived, how we connected, how we remembered. And yet memory is a fragile thing. It does not fossilize. It does not layer itself in ash and stone. It whispers, it shifts, it slips through generations like smoke. The survivors of Toba did not leave behind epics carved in basalt. They left footprints. They left burnt bone and scattered shell, pigment smeared on stone, graves lined with care. These are the echoes of a people trying not only to endure but to hold on to something, to mark their presence, to say, we were here. And perhaps deeper still, we came through something terrible, and we remember. Not in words, but in gesture, in repetition, in reverence. That reverence, born of almost ending, may be why we began to imagine our place in the cosmos, why we started to track the stars, to shape constellations from chaos, to look upward and find patterns where once there was only fear. The night sky, darkened for so long after the eruption, returned eventually, and with it, a hunger to understand. This was not science as we now define it, but it was something close, observation fused with wonder, a way of finding meaning in the rhythms of the world and anchoring ourselves to it. Perhaps that is the most profound shift of all, that we stopped seeing nature as merely something to survive and began to see ourselves as part of it. The scars of Toba are not only beneath our feet, but within our gaze. They shaped how we look at the world, with caution, with imagination, with questions. Who else has endured? What else lies beneath the calm surface of the earth? What powers stir beneath mountains waiting in silence? The awareness of these questions has never fully left us. It lingers in myth, in science, in the way we tell our children to be careful, to be prepared, and it lingers too in our ambition. The push not just to endure the next disaster, but to predict it, to outmaneuver it, to rise above it. In that sense, the fire that nearly ended us also lit the fuse of curiosity. But curiosity, like fire, is a force that must be tended. It can illuminate or consume. And this is perhaps the deeper lesson of Toba, that we are not the masters of catastrophe, but its students, that our cleverness must be matched by humility. For all our satellites and models, we still walk a delicate path. Volcanoes still sleep beneath our feet. Climate still turns on hidden hinges. Our place is never guaranteed, and knowing that should not paralyze us. It should sharpen us. It should remind us that the fire we survived once is not the last we will see. But if we carry the memory of that fire with care, if we let it inform our choices, our empathy, our foresight, then perhaps we can honour the near ending by building something more enduring in its wake. Because that is the true legacy of the Toba catastrophe. Not destruction, but transformation. From the ashes of loss came a deeper kind of vision, the kind that does not simply react but anticipates, that does not simply mourn, but creates. In the slow regrowth of the world after Toba, in the steady return of plants and herds and rivers, our ancestors mirrored that process. Their lives were quieter now, smaller camps, more careful migrations, but in that quiet, something remarkable took root. A new form of resilience, not just physical, but relational. They began to see survival as a shared task, not a solitary feat. In that there is a quiet heroism, one not born of conquest, but of care, of showing up day after day for each other, of remembering the faces of the lost and finding ways to carry them forward, in story, in song, in the names given to rivers and stones. Our ancestors did not forget the dark. They carried it with them, but they did not let it define them. They let it shape their strength. And as populations grew again, slowly stretching back across the continents, they brought with them this new ethic, this understanding that to be human was to be vulnerable, but also to be capable of astonishing endurance. We see it in the archaeological record, not as a single flash of brilliance, but as a slow accumulation of innovation. The spear thrower, the fish hook, the woven net, the carved pendant. These were not just tools, they were expressions of memory, answers to the question, how do we make this life more livable for those who come next? Because those who survived Toba did not do so by hoarding knowledge. They did it by sharing, and that more than any fire, more than any gene or mutation is what forged us. We're here because someone once passed on a way to fish, a way to keep warm, a way to find meaning in the stars, and in that passing on, a new story began to form. One not just about what had been lost, but about what could be built. The trauma of the past did not vanish, but it became layered with hope. The hope that the next generation might not suffer as deeply, that they might sing more loudly, paint more freely, love more fully. Even amid cold winds and uncertain seasons, this hope endured. It was not naive, it was tempered by history, but it endured, and it endures still, in our instincts to gather around a fire, to mourn together, to look up at the sky and wonder what comes next. These instincts are not modern, they are ancient, forged in the crucible of catastrophe, carried forward by hands that had every reason to give up, but didn't. We are not the beginning of the human story, we are its continuation, and what we choose to carry, what we choose to remember, shapes what the story becomes next, because now it is our turn. Just as those early survivors bore the weight of a world transformed by fire and darkness, we too face a world that trembles with change. Climate, conflict, technology. The landscape shifts beneath our feet, and while we may not stand beneath the shadow of a supervolcano, the echoes of Toba remain, not as a direct threat, but as a lesson, that survival is never a guarantee, that our dominance is not destiny, that fragility is stitched into the human experience, and that awareness is not weakness, but wisdom. In that wisdom, there is responsibility. We know more now. We can see the patterns, trace the warning signs, model the possible futures. But knowledge alone is not enough. We must carry it like our ancestors carried fire, carefully, reverently, with the understanding that what we do with it may one day define whether we are remembered as stewards or as stories lost to time. To endure is one thing. To endure with purpose is another. So what does it mean to carry the fire forward? It means remembering that we come from survivors, not of war or conquest, but of silence, of hunger, of loss so vast it erased whole bloodlines. It means honouring that survival not with pride, but with humility, knowing that every generation before us handed off something fragile and trusted us to hold it. The flame of curiosity, the thread of story, the impulse to create, even when the world seems broken. These are our inheritances, and perhaps most importantly, it means choosing not to look away, not from the warnings, not from the grief, not from the beauty that remains, even in a damaged world. Our ancestors could not predict the Toba eruption, but they could adapt. They could listen to the seasons, to each other, to the silence between storms. That listening saved them. It can save us too, if we let it. Because in the end, the fire that forged us was never just destruction. It was also revelation. It stripped away illusion. It reminded us in the harshest possible terms of our place in the order of things, small, brief, dependent on one another. And in that smallness something profound emerged, meaning, not handed down from the sky, but built slowly with hands and hearts and voices. The story of Toba is not just one of catastrophe, it is one of inheritance. We carry the shadows of the past and the light that survived it, and with every step we take, every choice we make, we add another sentence to a tale that nearly ended 74,000 years ago. But it didn't. We endured. And now we remember. And now we begin again. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ashes of time, for tracing the memory of fire, silence, survival, and the fragile brilliance of what it means to be human. If this story helped you feel a little more connected to the past, a little more in awe of the improbable thread we walk, or even just gave you a moment of stillness, I'm grateful you spent it here. I wonder what stayed with you. A buried ember of an ancient story, a detail that echoed strangely familiar, or a question you didn't expect to ask. Whether it was the hush that followed the long cold nightmare, the slow unfurling of ochre hands across stone walls, or the soft imprint of extinction in our genes, these fragments are what tie us together across distance and time. If one of those fragments lingered with you, feel free to share it below, as a quiet offering, a note in the chorus we're building, one story at a time. And if you'd like to wander with us again into deep time, silent ruins, and strange beginnings, subscribing or sharing helps keep these stories alive, and more are already waiting. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,